Good morning. It's the Ways and Means Committee. You all already know that. And today is April 30th. And it's 9 a.m. and we're beginning our work. H 949, the yield bill is, we thought it would be done with third reading, which is why this is scheduled. They're in between second and third reading in the Senate right now, but we're gonna take testimony on the bill as passed second reading fairly seamlessly, all things considered, to the yield bill. And and if something happens on the floor today, we'll just update. Sound good? Great. It's gonna be great. Okay. And so we are hearing from John and Julia, and then Senator Cummings is coming to join us and tell us the Senate's position. Then Jake from Tax is going to come in, and then we have a series of folks from the field who are going to share their thoughts on the Senate yield bill. And then after the floor today, frankly, almost any time the floor ends, we are going to do S325. And we do have a vote warrant for that. Should have a vote warrant for that, please. And that's it for the day.
Madam Chair, I have to leave by 3:30.
Okay. I think you told me that already.
Yeah, right. Just reminding you.
Okay. Done.
Okay,
No,
it's a simple bill anyway. Simple bill.
Thanks, Representative Kimball. Start.
Good morning. I am John Gray with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm still with the Office of Legislative Counsel. That's what I'll start using. I think that's a bit more
Saying something.
ominous.
Sorry.
So I like ominous, so I'm going to use that. We are talking about the yield bill. Less ominous, or depending on your perspective. I've invited too much comment. Okay. So I think you guys recall what the House passed, reserving half for following year. Buy down, you had a couple of technical measures. I can pull up what the House did if you're interested at some point, just to show you the difference, but I think it'll be pretty clear as we go through. So this is done as instances of amendment, in part because it's preserving the technical measures from the House piece. Those are untouched, right, related to statewide adjustment correction, berry tip, refund, census block grants, et cetera. But section 1 is, of course, changing the yields and the non-homestead rate. I can read out the numbers to you, but I think it's just going to make more sense if I say what was done. So you had the 104.9 million. You guys reserved half that for the following year. To buy down at that time. The construct here takes 100.9 million, I believe, transfers to the ed fund and uses the 100.9 million to fully buy down as much as possible within that, the rate. So you see a greater buy down here reflected. It is not the full 104.9 because 4 million of that figure that had been proposed to be fully transferred to the ed fund on the House side. It's being used for measures that appear later in the yield bill, which are a temporary 1-year expansion of the renter credit. And it's not an expansion in terms of who receives it, it is an increase in the cap and the calculation. So same pool, but the way to think about this is it's a near full usage of the 104.9 with a small sliver dedicated to the renter credit expansion. That gives you a property dollar yield of 9,395, income yield of 12,942, and a non-homestead rate of 1.648. Again, if it's helpful, I can, switch tabs to what the House passed, but I think you can guess the impacts. And you'll hear more about that from Julia. Okay. Page 2, the second instance of amendment. The House construct section 2 was the reserve. Obviously, that reserve is removed because they are not dedicating any funds for a reserve. They're using the 100.9 fully. And so they've replaced the reserve with the measures from S220. That's what you see here. You'll recall S220, we've talked about this before. This is beginning FY28. an exclusion of all voter-approved bond payments from the excess spending calculation, so no cutoff at July 1, 2024. But kind of more to the point, section 2A is, the core of S220. This is the dropping the excess spending threshold from 118 to 112% of the statewide average district per pupil spend from FY25 and going forward. So reducing the excess spending threshold to 112% and including the hold harmless provisions that we've talked about before, which say, if your district's ed spending hasn't increased or if your district's per pupil spend has not increased, you would not be subjected to the excess spending penalty. And then additionally, there's a review measure for the Secretary of Education to determine, even if you didn't meet those conditions, that if your district's per pupil ed spending that is in excess of the threshold was for a good cause or beyond the district's control, you too would not be subject to the excess spending penalty. Also, we've talked about before, but that's what's in here. So section 1 is changing the yields to reflect that $100.9 million buy down. And sections 2 and 2A are replacing you guys' reserve with the measures from S220. The remaining sections from you guys, from the House's bill, are preserved. That's the technical measures we talked about. But there is a third instance of amendment which adds some new sections related to that 4 million that I spoke about. So the 4 million of the 104.9 is not transferred from the general fund to the ed fund. And that is in the budget on the Senate side. The 4 million is in.
Meaning it's not transferred on the Senate, in the budget.
Yes, yes,
Like that.
They maintained it.
Reflected.
exactly. The budget and this bill align in how the funds are being moved to the ed fund. The 4 million is instead dedicated to this expansion. So you can see in existing law, there is a cap on the renter credit at 2,500. That cap is increased to 3,250. And then separately, aside from the cap itself, there's of course an effective cap when you just determine the calculation of the credit. The way that the renter credit works, it's based on where you fall within particular HUD-defined income limits. If you are less than or equal to the extremely low income limit, which I believe is 30% of AMI, you are currently under current law entitled to a credit in the amount of 10% of fair market rent, which will be defined for each county. This is saying that would be bumped up to 12.5% instead of 10% of fair market rent. So you would get a higher credit. Does not change the pool of folks who are eligible to receive the credit. At the upper end of the income limits for the renter credit is the very low income limit. And technically, I believe that HUD's definition of very low income, this is all existing law that I'm describing. HUD's definition, I believe, is 50%. So Vermont has a kind of state-specific getting at a different figure than 50%. It's 1.3 times that. So you end up with 65% of AMI is, I believe, what you come out with. Basically, this means that if you're at or below the extremely low income limit, so that 30% AMI, under current law, you can get 10% of fair market rent. And then if you're at the upper end, so all the way up to that very low income limit, which is at 65% in law here, you would be brought down to no credit, right? So it's basically smoothly bringing you across that. So this changes both the cap from 2,500 up to 3,250, and it increases the calculation from being 10% of fair market rent, which again would be a county-specific determination. It moves that up to 12.5%. And there's a bunch of places where we have to hit it, just because it appears throughout the statutes. You'll see again that in section 7, it's the same modification, but increasing that renter credit up to 3,250 there. Sections 8 and 9.
So this is when they prepare their taxes for 2027.
Yes. 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 And that tees up Senator Cummings' floor amendment, which I will flip to after this because there's an amendment that was integrated into the bill yesterday on the floor, and I'll talk about that. But yes, these are for claim year 2027, which reflects taxable year 2026, but it's what they're claiming next year. Thank you. That's helpful. Sections 8 and 9 are exactly what you would expect. They are, because this is a 1-year provision, what you see the next year is returning to existing law. So it's just reversing exactly what was done in section 6 and 7. So returning to the 2,500 cap and the 10% of fair market rent determination. I am going to skip over the effective dates section here because I'm going to flip to the floor amendment, which speaks to the effective dates, which is to your question. So yesterday, the Senate approved this amendment to be integrated into the report. So this is on for third reading today. This is part of the third reading today. Effective dates, all the measures that you guys had and the yields themselves, as you would expect, take effect July 1, 2026. The pieces to really call out are that the renter credit expansion and cap increase, that's section 6 and 7, they take effect this July 1, but they apply to claim year 2027. Sections 2 and 2A, that's the S220 measures. So that's the lowering your excess spending threshold, creating that review process, the hold harmless provisions, excluding all capital indebtedness from the excess spending calculation. That takes effect July 1, 2027, meaning that it takes effect beginning FY28. Sections 8 and 9, that's the return to current law, turning to the current renter credit provisions. That takes effect at the same time as the S220 measures, July 1, 2027, and applies to claim years 2028 and thereafter. So happy to take questions on that. Hopefully that all makes sense.
Representative.
Mr. John, so back at the beginning of
Yes.
the Senate's amendment, they took out the date for the debt by which it had to be approved. So is there anything in this bill or in law at this point that stops districts from going out and bonding a whole lot next year and having all of that excluded for the future from the S220 provision? Did I understand that correctly?
I think that maybe there's a gap here. The exclusion is from the excess spending. If you're just asking, could any debt, regardless of when it's approved, be excluded from the excess spending calculation? That is correct. That is what's here. And that's what's in S220 as well. It does not, it's not just legacy debt, it's all that.
New debt that they just
New
take
debt.
on the next year, so they could next time meeting day go out for a bond, and that would be excluded from
The
the
excess
excess spending threshold.
That's exactly right. And I think we talked about before as well in the hold harmless provisions. If you're in like, let's say you're at an insane figure, 150%, no one's at 150%, but if you're 150%, when these come into effect, but you spent no more than the last year, you're also exempt from the excess spending threshold. So, and if you think about it, even if you didn't have the exclusion for indebtedness, let's say that you were hit with like if you didn't have that contract, but it was just legacy. If you were hit with the excess spending threshold penalty 1 year because you had bonded for a school construction project, but the next year you still had the school construction project, right? Because it's an ongoing obligation. And you maintained all of your other expenses at the prior year, you also wouldn't be subject to the excess spending threshold in that instance. It's just another way of cashing out what it means for the hold harmless provisions. But you're correct. The exclusion for capital indebtedness from the excess spending penalty has no date limitation. Could be future.
I think Representative Westlake.
I think on the excess spending exemptions, I feel like I asked this last time and I just can't remember. The third instance there with Secretary of Education.
Yes.
Waive it. This might be a question for the agency, but what's the process behind that? Is it incumbent upon the secretary to go through when all the budgets come in? Do districts have to apply for that?
You definitely asked this last time.
I thought it.
Sorry, I didn't mean that as a, I meant
You
it
remain
as,
John Gray, I remain having this. question.
I meant that I recall giving my answer to this, which was that no process, I felt that this is what you were trying to tee up. There is no process spelled out here. It presumes that the secretary has this information to make the determination. So in the absence of taking any other steps, if this is what is enacted, it sort of leaves it to folks to get the information to the secretary. It does not spell out a specific process by which that would happen. If this, comes to conference committee and this is what's being contemplated, I think including a process or at least spelling out that that is what the intention is.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be very important.
Oh, sorry, it was.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
So I'm gonna go back to Representative Burkhart's questions. I assume that we're thinking of the next couple of years as a transition. And I hear you're saying it's not subject to excess spending penalty under the current funding formula, but this doesn't change. Senate contemplated continued exemptions for bonding in the future.
This would only apply as long as you've had excess spending as a concept. Maybe that's the piece that I was missing from your question. So if the foundation, thank you, if the foundation formula comes into effect, which would repeal the measures related to excess spending, this would no longer be something, so there wouldn't be any exclusion in that case.
This may be a question actually for joint fiscal, but did they take any testimony around timing issues as they might affect interaction with us in the legislature? Timing of bus contracts, timing of negotiating teacher contracts, incentives that in terms of how this affects decision making in school districts related to special ed, particularly extraordinary expenditures. Was there any discussion of that?
I do not recall that, but I was not in the room for the entirety of the duration that they discussed S220. I'm almost certain that at least one of the senators raised some of these concerns, but whether they took testimony from the field as to how this would impact someone, I'm not aware of that. And I see confirmation of what I
So they
I'm not aware of. Yeah. Yep.
John, this is effective, the lowering of the excess spending threshold for FY 28 year, right?
Mhm.
So that's why the excess spending, the capital expenses, exclusion of those debt payments is only effective July 1st, 2027.
Exactly. I would say there is no inherent linkage between those two. It's simply that S220 was the package that those traveled in. And you need the excess spending threshold update to occur FY 28. Another way of saying it, you could separate those pieces, right? There's no inherent link between them, but that was the package basically.
So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm good.
Okay, you've done the whole thing. Great. Any other questions for John Gray? Great. Julia Richter.
Morning.
Morning, Julie.
Director, Joint Fiscal Office. Nice to see you all after maybe a week.
I'm joining you back. Thank you. I'm joining the Zoom now.
And while I'm doing that, there's a couple documents posted on the committee page. There's the Ed Fund Outlook and the fiscal note for 949. And then we can talk in more detail about work or analysis related to S220 if that's helpful. Would you like me to start with the fiscal note or with the Ed Fund Outlook? Outlook. Okay. Thank you. So before I pull it up, I want to just remind the committee, I know you heard yesterday from AOE about the school budget updates. And so just the general process. We talked about this over the course of the winter as you worked on the Ed Fund Outlook, but as the AOE has more school budget information, they share that with us. Then we put that into our yield model so that you can get updated numbers. What we've always done and what we've done this year is we freeze the data in the yield model at points in time during the legislative session as committees or bodies are getting close to voting something out so that you can compare proposals using apples to apples data. So the outlook that I'm about to share includes updated data since I was last in here and does not yet include the updated data that AOE shared with you yesterday because Senate Finance still has the yield bill on third reading today. So once the yield bill is voted out of Senate Finance, whatever comes next, then we will be updating the yield model with the budget information you heard yesterday. So with that, share my screen. So there are 4 columns.
Can you oh, thanks.
4 columns included here. So as I mentioned, this is using budget data as of March 16th, 2026. This was the budget data that Senate Finance was working off of. Column A, this is that FY 2026 column. Column B, this is what was passed out of the committee. These are the rate and the yields that were included in the House passed 949. And as we just spoke about, that was based off of older budget data. So once we updated the budget data, what we found is because education spending came down a little bit and the shift of where that education spending was happening, it was no longer a uniform bill change, despite the fact that when you all voted it, it was a uniform bill change. So the House passed 949. If it were to go into law, we estimate it would be an average bill change of homestead and income of 6.4% and non-homestead of 7%. So I then resolved it using the budget information of saying, let's follow the intuition of 949, which is solving for a uniform average bill change and reserving half of the 104.9 million for buying down property taxes in FY 28. And because that budget data had come down a little bit, we now see that that would result in a uniform average bill change of 6.7%. So column C is showing that the 949 construct using the updated budget. Then finally, column D, this is 949 as recommended by Senate Finance. This is the construct that passed second reading in the Senate yesterday. As John just spoke to, they used 100.9 million of one-time general fund to uniformly lower property taxes in a single year in FY 27. That's that 100.9 is in addition to the 22.3 million of estimated end fund surplus. So about 22 million of one-time buy down. As John mentioned, that 100.9 is not the 104.9 because the Senate budget includes that one-time increase of the renter credit that is equal to 4 million. So they said we have a pot of 104.9 million for one-time relief. We're going to use 100.9 for buying down property taxes in FY 27. We're going to use 4 million for one-time increase of the renter credit. So we see the language associated with that increase of the renter credit associated with 4 million here in 949. We don't see the actual increase of that appropriation because that is living in the Senate budget.
Hang on. Will we hear from you or from the Senate on why they made the decision the way they did?
You won't hear from me.
Okay.
Also,
I'm just.
Senator Cummings will be 15 minutes.
Thank you. Good answer.
And I would say the same thing to the Senate if they ask why Ways and Means made the decision they made, just to be clear.
But they do.
Any other questions about the Ed Fund outlook? I guess I will just, because it's been a week or two since you've looked at this, I'll just remind the committee of this tax rate offset reserve that the House Ways and Means construct has. And the Senate doesn't have.
I think most of my questions for you, I mean, all of it, like, we worked through basically these scenarios. This feels clear to me. The exemptions in the yield bill and sort of what that means, what the excess spending threshold means, what the exemptions, to the excess spending threshold means, and like what that means in the off years is.
Sure.
Yeah.
So do you want me to go to the fiscal note or do you want me to go to the,
Whichever works better for you.
we can start in the fiscal note and then, Sorsha, perhaps we can post the spreadsheets that I had sent a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
Or the SU 26.
Yeah, sorry, before you go, can we go back to yellow?
Yes.
Could you just talk a little bit about available funds? Because we're not just talking about the 104, we're also talking about the unreserved, unallocated.
Yes.
Your unreserved, and that's a pretty significant change, I believe. Year to year, 26 to 27, so I'm hoping you could talk about that because that has an impact as well.
Absolutely. So what we're looking at here are lines 36 and 37. I know we don't have these headings up here, but recall this column here is referencing FY 26, and then these three columns are referencing FY 27. What we see here in line 36 is the prior year unreserved and allocated. So this is referring to the education fund surplus that's available to use to offset revenues that need to be raised, right? So in FY 26, there was 43 million of education fund surplus that could be used, put it towards something or not raise 43 million from property taxes. To your point, Representative Holcomb, in FY 27, there's 22.3 million of education fund surplus estimated for FY 27, which means that this is also one-time money that's being used to lower property taxes in FY 27. What we have seen over the past 5 years since I've been here, that the education fund surplus amounts have been decreasing each year over time. So we saw big education fund surpluses right around the time of the pandemic, where there was all of that overperformance of forecasted sales and use tax revenues. And then as that sort of has leveled out over time, we're seeing less education fund surplus year over year. So in sum, what we are seeing in these constructs is the use of the general fund transfer, be it 52.5, the House construct, to lower property taxes in FY 27, plus the 22.3 million. That is the total amount of one-time money used. The Senate construct that they're voting for reading today is the 100.9 plus the 22.3.
So the 1 year buy down last year was the buy down plus the 43.
Correct.
And what is the impact on next year's tax rates of using 100 plus the 22 this year? Potentially.
Well,
The risk zone, I realize it's you're
yeah.
prognosticating, you can't tell.
We don't know. It goes back to that that analysis that I presented, albeit maybe, I don't know, a few weeks ago, a month ago, that was looking at, it's really hard to forecast the ed fund into the future. And regardless of what happens, we know that using one-time money in 1 year artificially lowers the amount that needs to be raised in property taxes in that year. So then the following year, absent that one-time money, we will see a natural increase to make up for that difference of the one-time money use. So the more one-time money that is used in 1 year, absent the same amount of one-time money being available in the following year, will result in an average tax bill increase. And we will see that in the December 1 letter. And then it'll be something that these bodies will grapple with next year if it's used.
Your calculation before using the full 104.9 and the 22.3 was 15% in the next fiscal year.
You said
I think Julie's previous analysis showed that if we use the full 104.9 plus the 22.3 in this year, next year, you'd be looking at a 15% increase in property taxes. So now,
It's really stays the same.
if everything else being equal, so at 100.9 would be slightly less than that, it's a percentage increase.
I would need to pull up that slide deck.
Yeah.
If that's the percentage I said, then yes. And it was based off of a number of significant assumptions. Remember, we were looking at like, how much is the ed fund gonna grow? How are non-property taxes gonna perform? How much one-time money is gonna be available?
And also to understand this, people have already voted on their budgets on a certain set of assumptions about tax rates this year. But if this full buy down goes in, they will get a tax rate that's lower than the one they voted on. I think that's what this is saying.
I don't know what yields school boards use to communicate tax to voters.
I think they all use different ones.
Right.
That we can
Right.
ask the school boards association.
Right.
Any other questions about the outlook? Okay, let's go to the, wherever you were about to go.
I was gonna go to the fiscal note. I think Sources posted some. Okay, so there's also a couple of spreadsheets that you've already looked at that are from the S220 work that was done in Senate Finance about impact of different excess spending thresholds. I do plan to update those spreadsheets moving forward as this continues to be discussed, and I'm waiting until the Senate votes out 949 for all of the reasons that I already talked about. So just looking at the fiscal note, I'll focus on the exclusions for now. So as John spoke about, the 949 as being considered by the Senate pulls in S220, which does a number of things to the excess spending adjustment, right? It lowers the threshold. So under current laws, that average per pupil FY25 per pupil spend increased by inflation multiplied by 118%. S220 lowers it, so it'll be a lower threshold. And at the same time, S220 or these pieces within 949 include new exclusions and hold harmless that don't exist in current law for the excess spending adjustment. So, so the first one that is in section 2 of the bill, you'll recall that under current law, we've talked about this in this committee. There's that deadline condition, that temporal condition, where if bonds have been approved prior to July 1, 2024, then they are not, those bonds, that debt service payment is not included in the purpose of calculating excess spending. That's current law. So there's a deadline. Before, it's exempt. After, it counts for the purpose of calculating excess spending. 949 would repeal that deadline condition. So it'd say regardless of when the bond passed, all debt service payments are excluded for the purpose of calculating excess spending. So that expands the exclusion of calculating excess spending.
It's just bond debt. It's not other debt.
I would defer to John. I don't know.
Sorry, this,
Is that just bond debt or other debt as well?
the excess, it's just bonded, you're talking about the exclusion. Yeah.
Just talking about this debt service impact, there's sort of two pieces to think about. One, there is bond debt service that exists in the education fund that has passed since July 1, 2024. That currently would be calculated in excess spending if the school district holding that debt were to go over the excess spending threshold. After conversations with the bond bank, it sounds like there's about 11.6 million in annual additional debt service across 11 school districts. JFO can't estimate or predict if the removal of this exclusion would encourage more bonding, right? If it were to encourage more bonding, then that would increase cost to the education fund. What we do know is that because of the way that the education fund works, is the way the excess spending penalty works, is that if something is included in the calculation of excess spending, then that district is going to be double taxed on it. So that district is going to be responsible for raising more of it than if it's not included in excess spending. So all else equal, if you have something in excess spending in the current calculation and you remove it, essentially what that's doing is it's saying, okay, the district with that cost is not responsible for raising as much of it. It's not going to be double taxed on it. And instead it's going to be uniformly borne by, or more uniformly borne by its district. So it'll still be included in their per pupil spending. It just won't be included in their excess spending. Moving on.
And I just want to check that there's no approval, and maybe more question for John. There's no approval, and I think Bridget, you asked this, there's no approval process for the exemption for sort of future school bonding. It's just like any bonded debt would be exempt.
Yes, this is,
Okay.
if you don't have the foundation formula, it is in perpetuity.
Great.
So
Okay,
if the
thanks.
foundation formula happens, this won't be a structure that exists, but if it does not, it's in perpetuity, it's a permanent change, it's not just a 2-year change.
And it's for any debt into the future. The debt doesn't have to be like approved by a school construction advisory board or anything like that.
It doesn't need to be routed through the aid program or anything, it's
Okay.
just if you have voter approved bond payments.
Thanks.
Julia, one thing about this particular piece is that of the 11.6 million borne by 11 different school districts, not every one of those 11 are currently over the excess spending threshold, correct?
Correct. When I looked into it, and I would need to, I could come back, I just don't have it in front of me. I believe that there's 1 or 2 school districts that are estimated to trip the excess spending adjustment. The others are not.
Sorry, Mark.
That's fine. Doesn't this go against what 220 is looking to do?
This is 220.
This is 220 in here.
But yes, I agree. There's like a little bit of a counterintuitive thing the Senate did.
Right.
Yes.
A little bit.
It begs the question, what is 220 trying to do? I think.
Okay. Thank you.
That's the question I asked earlier. Did they take any testimony about, I mean, the last time we tried to do short-term caps, what they ran into and they removed the caps because there were all kinds of accounting timing issues that were relatively arbitrary to total cost. But, you know, if you resolve a contract that's been delayed, you may have to true up bus contracts, you know, food contracts, they're often 3-year contracts. There are potential huge implications for extraordinary expenditures in special ed because of the incentives you can put in play for a couple of years that then would have long-term fiscal impacts potentially. Were those things discussed in trying to come up with this?
I can't provide any more context than John.
It's for Anne, actually. We'll be here in a minute.
Let me get to the other piece of the exclusions.
Please.
So we just spoke about the exclusion, or really expansion of the exclusion of school debt from the excess spending penalty. The other piece of this is section 2A would amend the calculation of, or would create a hold harmless provision from the excess spending adjustment for certain school districts. So under current law, there isn't a hold harmless provision for the excess spending threshold. There's the one exclusion and that's it. What this would do is it would be a three-part test. And if you pass any of those parts, then you would not be subject to having a double tax on your excess spending. So
Did you finish your sentence?
sure.
That was a mess.
I'm not trying to interrupt, just,
I know you are. It's Julia's being very responsive.
so this is a continuation of my other question, and why did the Senate do what they did? So
So that's a question for Anne, not for Julia.
it is a question so it would be appropriate when a senator comes in to discuss specific things like the excess spending threshold when that occurs, right?
So If you're asking why the Senate did it, that would be a question for Senator Cummings. If you're asking what they did, that's a question for Julia.
What I get, I'm trying to figure out when is most opportune time to direct my question to why the Senate did what they did. So I'm just putting my name in queue that I want to.
Okay, I'm glad everyone has questions for Senator Cummings. It'll be so much fun. I don't know if she's ever come up here to do this before.
Got it.
Yes.
So what the hold harmless provision is it's these different tests. So one is looking at, did a school district increase its education spending year over year? So if that school district did not see an increase or saw a decrease in their total education spending compared to the prior year, they are not subject to the excess spending adjustment, regardless of what their education spending is. If they held steady at their education spending level or decreased, no excess spending penalty. Similarly, if a district did not see an increase in its per pupil education spending compared to the prior year, then it also would not be subject to the excess spending penalty. You could fit into both of those, you could fit into one of those, either way, you wouldn't have the excess spending penalty. And then third, there's also this, I don't know if anyways, there's this third piece where there's this test from the secretary. So you can go before the secretary, and if the secretary determines, and I would defer to John on the language, but essentially determines that it was okay that your education spending or per pupil spending is above that excess spending threshold, then you are also exempt from the excess spending penalty. So there's 3 different potential ways to be exempt from the penalty.
Can you explain if you spend more and then spend less again? I remain confused by that.
So,
Oh, hi. When did you get here? Oh.
So the test is essentially, if your education spending does not increase compared to the prior year, you are exempt from the excess spending penalty. If your per pupil spending does not increase compared to the prior year, then you are exempt from the excess spending penalty.
Okay, thanks.
So let's say you're Danville. And it looks like if we move this down to 112, it looks like your excess spending penalty would be something like $561,000. If they maintain their current level of spending plus $1, does that mean they're liable for the whole $561,000 at 112%? Or does that mean the amount they exceed the previous year's spending is subject to the excess spending penalty?
I'm going to defer to John.
Sorry, I'd like to jump back for what's the question?
I'm just trying to figure out how this plays out in real terms. We're using weighted spending, right? So if there's an underlying error in the weights, it's going to be amplified. And you have a school like Danville, hypothetically, at 112% based on JFO modeling, they have a penalty of $561,000. If they held their spending per weighted pupil constant plus $1, which is how much they tripped it by this year,
I see.
are they liable for the full $561,000, or are they only liable for a penalty on the amount by which they tripped the?
They are liable for the full amount. The idea is that you get basically it deems that your excess spending penalty is $0 if you meet one of the conditions, but if you don't meet the conditions, you're otherwise subject to the standard excess spending calculation, which is just based on how much you exceed the threshold rate. So you're kicked out of the hold harmless and are then subject to the standard calculation. It's not because you only went over what you did last year by $1, you paid penalty on that. It could result in quite fluctuating.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up before we change topics, because the excess spending penalty is a bit of a moving target because it's based on the average weighted spending.
FY 25, but inflated.
inflated. But these districts are also trying to figure out how they're gonna line up with that in the context of changing student numbers, but also we're in the sense of, like, things are still changing and that's affecting other people's spending. And so how are they gonna know that they don't trip it by $1? When someone trips it by $1, that's something happened. You know, like, they were trying to stay below it. And they were-
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but to your point, one of the effects of having a hold harmless provision is that a slight difference can put you fully into the penalty, but maybe no change in your behavior could result in a wild difference to the whole.
And was there, I'm just gonna ask this again, was there any testimony in the Senate about the fact that we are rating tuition districts, even though the study author said
So
so?
that's a good question for Senator Cummings, because these two were not there for all the testimony.
Okay.
Is this a question for?
Yeah, this is, so this is along the same lines of the question. So then if you do have a district then that trips the excess spending threshold this year, all of that excess is then sort of, well, I guess that's one question, is all the, so their ed spending is higher this year than the threshold, but then the next year they would be held harmless, even if they didn't bring their spending down at all.
As long as they maintained their spending level, yes.
So they would go from tripping it one year to then the next year not having excess spending, even though their spending is essentially the
If it's
same.
the same, yes.
And one last clarifying question on it. You said adjusted for inflation. So is it from, if you're at $17,000 a student currently, which is over the excess spending threshold, and then next year you're still at, I just lost my line of reasoning, but if you're,
So
if you're higher than that.
I think I understand where your question is going. The
17,000.
the threshold, it's the threshold that is adjusted for inflation. It is not the hold harmless provision.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to know. Yeah.
Yes.
And this comes back to the inflator, right? And it's NIPA again? Or what's the inflator that is?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're using a products inflator for a staff-driven industry, just pointing that out. And people negotiate contracts. You don't usually negotiate for a year. You often negotiate for 3 years. So you could get nailed just because you resolved your contract in a specific calendar year, not because you're choosing to suddenly increase or make decisions, spend and propagate that, or have a bad vote.
Thank you, Julia. And Senator Cummings, Chair Cummings, would you like to join us? Thank you so much for being here. We know that the bill is still on the floor, so I'm sorry to be getting further ahead than we meant to. I just didn't want to reschedule everyone.
It went well. I have not seen any amendments to this bill yet. I have several from miscellaneous.
We'll talk about that another time.
But that's yet.
Kind of amendment bait, that other bill, yes. That's. Would you like to tell us your thoughts on the yield bill? And then I think we have a couple questions.
Okay. I've been listening. I think the yield bill, what we did to your bill. First thing we did was spend all the 100 point whatever million to buy down the property taxes this year. There was a feeling that the average was 7 plus or minus a percent. That meant that some people would be getting double digit, and I think we know double digit is really difficult for people. And so we took it down to using all the money, and we'll deal with next year. And we then it was brought up that we haven't done anything for renters in years, and rents are going up and we haven't adjusted. And there was also I think, a desire to get votes for the bill. So we took a portion of that 100 million and gave an equivalent credit to renters for 1 year. So that was it. So we have, that brought the average increase, putting the full 100 million in, was 3.6. The average after doing the renters was 3.8. And the members of my committee that were set, and I would say it was the majority, on buying down rates this year, could live with that. So that was the financing part. No, it's not in the yield bill. It's in miscellaneous tax. We did both of them in the same day after several days of going into the evening. So I tend to get them
Totally understood.
conflated.
I think we have a lot of, the excess spending threshold.
Yes,
you
that
have
was your,
any questions there?
yes. There was a request from leadership that go in, because the Senate is concerned. I know we're all concerned about the cliff. We keep buying down tax rates, and at some point, we're going to pay the price, or taxpayers are, and we're amongst them. But we're not, and we know the foundation formula is coming, and we know for some schools that's going to be a huge cliff. But we also know we are not seeing a whole lot of movement on the part of schools to start making, they don't need us to tell them to do CSUS. They can do those. And I think it's an effort on our part to say, look, you have got to start cutting back. And you've got, by whatever form you can do that. I think there was, we did a lot of ups and downs and what ifs. And we recognize that no matter what we do, something will happen that doesn't fit in. The dollar over your per pupil spending. So there is an appeal process in there to say, look, that isn't fair to hit us with 540,000 when it's only $1 and this was the cost. The school bus caught fire and we had to replace it, whatever. So we put an appeals process in there. Knowing full well the 220 is, I don't know if it's in this committee or where it is, it's in the House.
Right there, we figured you were gonna put it in the yield bill, so.
You've got fewer bills on your wall. Oh, no, there you go.
Those are just referred
I
bills.
moved for one cork board.
We figured you were putting in the yield bill, so we.
Okay,
Everything
I mean,
figured.
it's there, but I think when we sent it, we knew you'd monkey with it. But I think it's just to keep that discussion going. What do we do about school spending?
And so the exemption that you built in, so you explained the thinking behind the sort of appeals process. The exemption you built in for if you spend more and then you spend less or spend the same amount.
Yes.
How do you imagine that works?
Spend more and then you spend.
If you spend above the excess spending threshold, but then you maintain that spending, you're not subject to the excess spending threshold anymore. The following year.
Yeah. We didn't really talk about that.
Okay, thanks. Cool. Representative Maslin, you had a question that you were wondering about.
I did. This did partially answered. I guess I should just keep going, and if it comes up in more coaching form, I'll raise my hand.
Okay. Representative Holcomb, I think, oh, sorry, Troy, go ahead.
Yeah, so Senator Cummings, the idea of maintaining your existing spending levels, but then accounting for inflation or other increases in healthcare or teacher contracts. So that may be 5-6% anyway on a budget. So I think what you're really saying is even with excess spending, if you're maintaining the same amount, then they're going to have to cut 5 to 6 to 7% from their budget.
Depends on when your contracts come up. But yes, I think we've been told that actual school employment is going up. Schools do control that, seem to be losing teachers and hiring other personnel. All of those personnel now get a platinum level healthcare program. And that adds to the cost. It's not just teachers, it's cafeteria workers, it's paras. And I think part of it is just trying to get schools to actively join in the discussion about what is going on and not. We need to be able to talk through this. And if there's other things that can be done, we're open to having you do it. I think there's a need, and I think it's coming out of elections and it's political, to let taxpayers know that we know that something has to give here. And probably the taxpayers have given all they can give.
So I was just trying to understand what that looked like, and I think that's what may be the intent.
Representative Holcomb?
I appreciate the clarity that this is about our political need to show taxpayers we're listening. I actually feel that this school district spending is now at about 3.9%. I just think we need to keep saying that. And that is despite what looks to me like very significant cost shifting from the state budget. You know, if we are collapsing our state mental health network, that is going to fall back into schools because they're the payers of life.
Yes.
I want to just drill down a bit because we had AIR came in and testified. The American Institutes for Research, people did the initial weighting.
Okay.
And they said,
Professor Colby.
yeah, Professor Colby. They said
Professor Colby,
could not-
that's what I know that, yes.
They said,
Finance didn't do the weighting.
well, we did in 127, and this body chose to apply weights to
Yes.
tuition students, even
Yes.
though Professor Colby and her team said don't apply weights to tuition students. So I'm looking at two of the districts, one of which is affected and one is not by this spending penalty. Danville has poverty that is 13% higher than Peacham, which is right next door. It operates K-12. It is receiving about the same amount of weights as Peacham, which is weighted, even though it tuitions at half of its levels. Peacham has higher spending per ADM, but because of the weighting, it's just not going to be affected according to this analysis by the excess spending penalty. So effectively what we're doing is we're penalizing rural districts that operate public schools. Is that the intent here? Because they're
No.
disproportionately the ones that are being hit by this.
No, that is not the intent. And I think we knew that weighting can vary widely. And part of the concern, what we did get discussed, was that if you lost 2 weighted students in a small school, that's going to have a lot more impact than losing 2 weighted students in South Burlington or Champlain, a big school. And I'm trying to remember, because we did this 3 months ago. That was one of the reasons for the appeal, that there are things you can't control. And so we wanted to make sure that those things could be dealt with.
Thank you, Senator Cummings.
Can I just ask what that means to control? So 60% of the kids who go to Danville,
Yes,
the poverty rate is 60%. The poverty rate in Danville is only about 46.
Yes.
So they are serving
a very,
They could just say, we won't take those tuition students. Is that the intent here? Because that
No,
would bring
I
down
think
cost of
the-
people.
intent is to let, if not them, then other schools, and this may not be the best way to do it. But I think we all know that there are possible mergers in those areas. We also have a couple of independent schools in play in those areas. But that schools need, you can't just sit back and say, we don't like districts are merging and keep raising your spending. That we do need to do structural change in order to keep schools affordable. We know schools are making educationally unwise decisions to keep their budgets down. And I think this would, think this is another shot across the bow. We are serious. We need to take serious steps. If these aren't the right steps, then what are? Because the foundation formula is coming. It is highly doubtful we're going to have $100 million to buy down the tax rates next year. We are doing an awful lot in health and welfare, which I'm missing, but to bring down the cost of insurance. However, we also have 3 requests in there to add things to
No, and we need to keep
to the covered costs,
open.
which will add to the cost of insurance. So nobody's quite gotten the message that these are not, the good times are over, and cuts are going to need to be made. Zach, you know, it's got to give somewhere.
Thank you. I think Representative Burkhart, you have a question, and then we're gonna let you go back to health and welfare.
You can say.
Madam Chair, what's the districts, I assume you took testimony from districts who are potentially going to trip the excess spending threshold this year,
Yes.
even in its current form. What did they tell you about why they are going over the excess spending threshold and how they are trying to make cuts? Because you mentioned a couple of times that there may be unwise decisions to
Yes.
try to stay under the excess spending threshold. Just say another word about what those decisions are.
I think every school is making decisions, you know, there's, because we don't have a statewide graduation standard, I think you're finding more schools don't offer probably the full range of courses that students could benefit from or need. I think we're finding that not sports, but more in the arts are being cut. I know second language below high school level is being cut because you don't, you know, AP courses are being scaled back because you don't have enough students to make it financially viable to do that. But again, these are things you could do CSIS for. You could, you know, set up and do a class over Zoom. I mean, you could, and I think that's what we're seeing. And we haven't heard people come in. We're not the education committee, but we haven't heard of serious discussions in this area.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming upstairs.
Thank you.
Yes.
It'll be worse with miscellaneous tax.
No, it will not.
Well, I have a bill that's rewriting income tax and the finance section of the second home tax.
It'll be a good time.
It'll be
Good luck.
good.
Good luck.
So
Thank you.
good.
We'll see you there.
We'll see.
We have many people scheduled. And what's your schedule look like, Jake?
It's fine.
You can feel flexible?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. Sherry, I'm gonna jump to you next, if that's okay for you.
Absolutely, we are ready to
Thank you.
go. I just need to be able to share my screen. Oh, and I can. So as an educator, to me, it's always important to have visuals. So I've got a slide deck that goes with my presentation, and hopefully this will help give some context to some of the hard questions you're having to address right now. Just hang on 1 second, I'm just moving some things around. Are you able to see this presentation?
It's small.
And actually, Sherry, sorry, 1 second, before you start, I think we have 2 people in the Zoom that are not on our witness list.
So I have Raphael Adamek, who's my Director of Technology and Innovation, and I have James Fenn, who's my Director of Finance and Operations in that. And if there's a question you asked that I can't address, so I thought having them might be
Okay.
helpful.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that they were known quantities. So thank you, Sherry. Back to you.
So I'm not sure why you are not seeing the full screen. Is that
Oh,
on?
wait, I think we can change that.
Okay.
Second. It's the top left. I wonder if we could like spotlight it.
If not, I don't want to, I can go ahead and speak my presentation if that's an obstacle.
I'm sure. Sure, what?
It's showing on the Zoom, but it's not showing. Oh, you just went right.
Oh, we were so close.
There we go.
Hey, thank you so much. I just wanted you to see some of the faces of my students and kind of the testimony. So good morning, members of the House Committee on Ways and Means. I'm Sherry Souza, Superintendent of the Mountain View Supervisory Union. And I thank you for the opportunity to discuss the impact of H949 on our 7 communities. My testimony today centers on correcting the misconceptions surrounding our per pupil spending by highlighting the realities of rural education, detailing the devastating programmatic cuts and abrupt threshold drop to 112% would force upon our district, and expressing our strong support for the bill's exclusion of capital debt. Ultimately, I urge the committee to consider a gradual phase reduction of the threshold and to establish a floor spending amount that ensures that all students are afforded adequate funding, which is stated in the aim of the foundation formula. Oh, hang on 1 second, I'm trying. There we go. There we go. Mountain View School District has been recognized for many of its attributes, including strong academic outcomes, diverse student opportunities, and engaged communities. MVSD also has the reputation of being a high-spending district. When comparing LTW ADM per pupil cost across the state, MVSD is within the top 5 highest spending districts. It is crucial to provide context behind these numbers. The MVSD salary grid and benefits package are within the average range and competitive with surrounding SUs and SDs. All of our classrooms meet Act 73's minimum class size. Currently, MVSD does not meet the recommended number of instructional coaches stated in the last APA report. In addition, some say I shouldn't say this out loud, MVSD does not meet educational quality standards for the number of nurses or librarians. The unified arts offerings at our elementary schools are comparable to other SUs, SDs. MVSD has been recognized by the AOE for reductions made in the use of paraeducators, both in general education setting and in special education, which is the goal of Act 173. Further, MVSD has been commended by the AOE for containment of special education costs. The MVSD central office team is strictly limited to a superintendent, director of finance, director of curriculum, director of technology, and the director of student support services. Our technology department, for example, consists of 3.5 full-time equivalents for approximately 1,300 students and staff members. I do not believe that MVSD educators are overcompensated nor are our schools overstaffed. So why is MVSD so expensive? A number of factors specific to our district have resulted in per pupil spending above the established threshold. These include geographic isolation, the calculation of the LTW ADM, the MVSD Articles of Agreement, the offering of universal pre-K, and the cost of fully funding our facility needs. While the 7 towns of MVSD are located in the center of Vermont, we're functionally a rural district. We are located between the cities of Hartford, Springfield, and Rutland. MVSD receives limited support from our 4 designated agencies, as communities with greater population density receive a higher proportion of those resources. Counseling and mental health service must be provided at each of our schools so that our students are able to access their education. Our towns also lack access to needed healthcare and public transportation, requiring our schools to step in and fill those service gaps. I'm sorry, I'm seeing, are you able to see this whole?
We can, yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, that's better. In a side-by-side comparison of Mountain View School District with another district in the Southeast region, it is important to note that unweighted spending per pupil in attendance indicates that MVSD spends less per pupil than that district. MVSD has 936 students who live in our 7 towns, and our LTW ADM is 1,520. The number of students residing in that district is 1,236, comparative. Their LTW ADM is 2,266. MVSD has an adopted budget of $30 million, which is a $30,990 cost per student in attendance. This district has adopted a budget of $39 million, resulting in a $34,096 cost per student in attendance. This LTW formula, ADM, puts the district below the threshold and MVSD above, even though the actual spending per pupil in attendance at MVSD is less. In July of 2019, our town successfully merged under Act 46 to become one supervisory district, with Agency of Education approved Articles of Agreement. The structure of those agreements now mandates how resources are allocated across the district and how campuses are maintained. These contractual requirements articulate accountability regarding costs, staff, and student outcomes, as well as the strict process for closing a school. While this document has had a significant positive impact on equity of educational experience for all of our students, there are associated costs that must be represented in our annual budget. While the closing of schools is not explicitly stated in any of the current transformational legislation, a significant lowering of the excess spending threshold will inevitably result in small schools being forced to close. The smallest school within our merged district is Reading Elementary School. There are those in our region who have inquired about the implications of closing this vibrant school community. First, the one MVSD elementary school within the state recommended allowable driving distance, whether that's 25 minutes or an hour, is Woodstock Elementary School. It does not have the physical capacity to absorb these students. Since offering universal pre-K and MVSD, the space required by statute for our youngest students has reduced the available number of classrooms. Furthermore, even if Woodstock Elementary could meet the needs of the RSD children, the cost reduction to our budget would only be $750,000. This amount alone would not bring MVSD below the current excess spending threshold. Members of the MVSD school board have reached out to other local school districts and supervisory unions to explore how our small schools could better partner. At this time, due to the Articles of Agreement and neighboring districts, that's as far as we can go in making these kinds of significant, potentially cost-saving changes. MVSD has maintained stable student enrollment since the end of the pandemic. Many attribute that consistency to offering universal pre-K at all of our elementary schools. This board and community decision to provide high-quality early education in line with state requirements has provided the foundation for significantly improved student outcomes. However, this decision also comes with a price tag that impacts our overall budget. Finally, another source of financial strain for MVSD is our severely depleted middle and high school facility. Our communities have supported multiple bonds to address the needs of a failing building. Since the 2025 yield bill, facility costs have been combined with per pupil spend, further exacerbating our bottom line. With this context in mind, MVSD is now facing how a sudden reduction in the threshold from 118% to 112% will impact our students and programs. Currently, our taxpayers send over 39 million to the Ed Fund and keep 25 million. If the threshold is dropped to 112%, the communities at MVSD would be sending an additional 1.4 million. Our money is going to districts that are underfunding education. For our communities, that means for every dollar raised by local taxes, 61 cents goes to the statewide education fund and 29 cents stays in our district. Changing the threshold to 112% would increase the funds going to the state to 62 cents for every dollar raised. I hope this financial context provides a clear understanding of why NVSD lands in the category of highest spending district. Many of the decisions driving the amount of money raised annually are outside the control of our board and our taxpayers. In addition to the factors listed, we cannot ignore rising healthcare costs, the impacts of tariffs, negotiated annual salary increases, and skyrocketing energy expenses. MVSD has inherently high per pupil expenses coupled with failing infrastructure, making it one of the districts most sensitive to H949. Cost containment and fiscal responsibility have always been at the forefront for the MVSD Board Finance Committee. Every year, they weigh the cost of funding public education in our rural communities against the impact on property taxes for those who choose to live in our region. They deeply feel the pressure of presenting a livable budget. The impact of moving from a threshold to 118% to 112% in a single year represents an added cost of $2,862,504 to our taxpayers. Even if our localized spending and per pupil costs don't increase, too many of these broader expenses are completely out of our control. Last year, we froze the number of full-time positions in the district. No new positions were added, and some unfilled roles were eliminated entirely. Even with the strict cost containment, our budget increased by 6.7%. If H949 were to pass as is, and the board decided to level fund our FY 28 and 29 budgets, MVSU would need to cut roughly $1,305,177 from our FY 28 budget, the equivalent of 12 teachers. The board would then need to cut an additional $1,298,000 in FY 29, representing another 12 teachers. In just 2 years, we would be cutting 20% of our teaching staff. The erosion of educational offerings and the resulting harm to our students would be profound, all while leaving the state's fundamental funding inequities completely unaddressed. For a district our size, this impact would significantly restrict or eliminate our public pre-K program, force the relocation of students to different campuses, adding to family stress, and greatly reduce the vital learning pathways currently available to our secondary students. The strength of H949 is the capital debt exclusion. This expense has been artificially inflating MVSD's per pupil spend, creating a double taxation penalty. As voters have repeatedly demonstrated, this region is fully committed to providing a healthy, safe learning environment for its children. Decoupling capital expenses from the per pupil spend allows our district to finally move forward in addressing significant infrastructure needs. Overall, the intent of 949 to manage education spending growth and respond to the heavy burden of increasing property taxes is commendable. I applaud the effort of both the House and the Senate have made to exclude capital debt from per pupil spending. Our schools simply cannot continue on this path of decay. However, addressing the root causes of the financial situation of all our districts find themselves in is the necessary first step to containing costs. MVSD did not become one of the highest spending districts because we ignored the taxpayer burden. Our 7 communities highly value public education and actively support school budgets to meet those goals. Dropping the threshold from 118 to 112 in a single budget year fails to acknowledge realities of offering responsive education in a rural setting. Instead, implementing a gradual phase reduction that allows school boards and their communities time to adapt is a much more sensible approach. While H 949 attacks educational spending by lowering the threshold, if the state truly wishes to meet the Act 73 expectation of improving education equity, I believe that a spending minimum must also be identified in the yield bill to adequately educate students in a rural setting. As national state testing has indicated, Vermont is currently not meeting its constitutional responsibility to educate its children. Towns should not be allowed to under-resource their schools. This only further compounds the inequities in student experiences. In summary, I genuinely appreciate the dedication of the House and Senate to Vermont's children and taxpayers during the session. We all share the goal of ensuring our youngest citizens thrive while keeping Vermont an affordable place to live. The strongest merit for me is the H 949 for my district is the removal of capital debt for the per pupil spend calculation. Our communities desperately need every tool available to address failing facilities. However, drastically lowering the threshold adds impossible stress to the formulation of a fiscally responsible budget. I strongly urge the Committee on Ways and Means to approach the shift from 118 to 112 with a phased reduction, allowing districts to adjust over time. I also ask that a minimal allowable per pupil spending amount be defined so that all students have adequate resources to Act 73 expectations. I hope my testimony has provided essential context as to why districts exceed the current threshold due to pressure outside our control and how the impending decisions of this legislature will have an irrevocable impact on the students of Vermont. Our children only have access to this life-changing resource for a very short period of time in their lives. It is our collective responsibility to ensure those few years in our classrooms meet the expectations of our families, taxpayers, and communities. Thank you.
Sherry, before we go to questions, I have drastically overscheduled the morning.
Yes.
I would like to apologize less to the committee and more to all the people sitting on the benches whose schedules I'm going to try to rearrange. And so I'm wondering if it would work for the Superintendent's Association, the School Boards Association, the school business officials, and the NEA to move to tomorrow morning. You cannot. Okay, can you? Great. Sue left, so maybe it'll work for her. She's with you. You two are together. Okay. And Elizabeth, can you move to tomorrow morning?
What time tomorrow morning would it be? Do you know?
Really, like 11-ish maybe?
Yes, I can do that.
Great, thanks. Okay. Done. Jim, your question.
Yeah.
Or Sherry.
Thank you. Thank you all for your testimony. Early, Sherry, you mentioned phase reduction in the cap. When I represent, along with Rebecca, Thetford, Sharon, Stratford, Norwich, and we're seeing a catastrophic our catastrophe in our future, shall we say. And I've been interested in the phase. I'm looking at the screen. I should look at the camera, I guess. I'm very much interested in phase reduction, and I can think of 3 different ways that might be accomplished, and I'm interested in your comments. One is, as you suggested, phasing down from 118% to 112 over a couple of years. You also mentioned get right to it. The spending floor.
Yes.
And the other way it might be done that I was thinking of is, a dollar cap in each of the next several years, like for instance, $600,000 penalty one year down to, $200,000 to 400,000 to 600,000. I mean, the penalty in the dollar amount so that the school district would see a real number and could adjust accordingly. I wondered if you'd comment on each of those three. Because I'm interested in some sort of amendment to this so that basically we're interested in the same goal, which is to reduce the catastrophic immediate impact on school districts so that they have time to work their way around to a viable solution. So your comments, ma'am, would be much appreciated.
And I'll invite James Fenn, who's my director of finance, to also speak, because he's looked at the numbers, really looking at, and again, understanding and appreciating the pressure that the House and Senate is feeling from our taxpayers. Absolutely, we need to figure out ways we can contain costs. As I said in my presentation, there are many things that I do not have control. Articles of agreement, I cannot work around that. Our finance committee cannot work around that. We cannot walk around our CBAs. We can look at positions elimination. So when we balance the things that we can control and can't control, having more time to work those through, and I earlier representation in that we are making decisions that are fiscally irresponsible. It's really hard to hear because I sit in every one of those meetings. I sit with my principals. We are really trying to contain costs as seen by freezing and reducing positions last year. So I really want people to know that we are serious. Our school board is serious, and there are things that we just can't fix. Jim, would you respond to the phased approach and how that would allow us, as you also are members of the Finance Committee?
Sure. My biggest concern about the index for the threshold right now is, and this is not part of your current bill, is it's tied to what it has been tied to a NEEP index. And I know you've chosen a new index this year, but the index is going up about 2.5%, while health insurance is going up over 6%. Other costs are going up 2 or 3 times the index. So our drivers of our spending are going up faster than the threshold is because the index is not reality in the world that we live in. So I would strongly encourage an index that actually reflects the consumer prices of Vermont versus one that's as conservative as is currently being used. As far as the phase-in, I don't know I think a phasing gives us time to work on things, but without some sort of cap on some of the expenses that we can't control, any reduction in that threshold is going to hurt all of the communities, and you'll see more and more of the districts go over the threshold each year you reduce it.
And I think another piece, if I can quickly put this in, and I alluded it to my testimony, there are opportunities for small schools to combine, but if they're in different SUs and SDs, we don't have within a year's time the opportunity to make those changes. They take time. And last week I testified, or 2 weeks ago, around becoming a merged district. That took 5 years. The kinds of things that need to happen contractually, calendars, there are so many pieces to that work that is totally being ignored. And as a survivor of Act 46, for a district that already had towns working together, the realization that this work of merging and closing, again, I can't close the school next year. I would have to go through a vote. I have a process. There are articles of agreement. So there's assumptions that we can snap our fingers and reduce 750,000, even if I wanted to. And I think there's opportunities there. I can't do that because of articles of agreement. So in so many ways, our hands are tied, and there's assumption of that quick reduction. Well, then you just can cut that money and you can cut that school and you can move those kids. I can't, because I have to operate, and so does my school board, under already approved articles of agreement. So there's assumptions about how quickly we can reduce our budgets that are not even close to the reality we live in. Whether you live in my region or the Northeast Kingdom or Burlington, we all operate under very strict regulations and guidance that we cannot correct for in a year's time.
Last question, and then we're gonna.
Sherry, it's a shameless brazen plug. What impact on the number of tuition students that are going to Mountain View's high school has been affected by the condition of the school? Could you talk about the trend in your tuition students coming to the school?
Yes, and Raphael Adamek, who's my enrollment guru in the district. But to speak to, so in this school, in the school year 25 or 24, 25, we had 20 different communities sending tuition students to our high school. Raffles raised his hand. This year, we lost some of those tuition students, which impacts our bottom line. So why would you choose a high school, even though we offer AP and pathways and excelling academic opportunities, when you have no confidence in the facility that your child will be going to? And we don't have confidence. We could, and this year almost needed to close because our sewage system wasn't working. So we are losing tuition students as a result of our failing facility. It is not because of our academic programs. It is not because of our outcomes for students. It's because, and we've spoken to parents and communities, they are concerned that if they choose our high school, that high school will not be in existence at any point in the school year, whether it's next year or the year after.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us and for your really careful presentation. Appreciate all the details.
Thank you for inviting me. And again, if there's any time that I can step in or questions you have, please, Charlie has my contact information as well as my team.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
So we're gonna go to Ted and Cassandra next, if you're ready. And then I'm gonna go to Jake and then Sue and Chelsea. Having the same, yeah. There we go.
Okay, good morning. Say dates again. Bill, Senior Fiscal Analyst from the
I need John's joke. I'm just teasing. Sorry, Ted.
Well done.
Yes, and Cassandra Ryan, CFO for the Agency of Education.
So the AOE's comments on the yield bill, the Senate version of the yield bill, correct? So in order, section 1, setting of the yield amounts, AOE has no comment.
Well, do you want questions for each section, or would you rather we go through the whole thing and then have questions for sections?
I think that's up to you. How do you want to approach it?
Let's try going section by section with questions, and then if we lose time, I'll bring it back in again. But AOE has no comment on whether we put all the money towards this year's tax rates or next year's tax rates in terms of how it would impact districts budgeting next year. Okay. Great. Section 2.
Again, holding the reserve for fiscal year 28. Didn't comment on that as well.
Okay.
Section 2 of the Senate version for the excess spending, specifically the inclusion of the principal and interest payments for all bonds. The AOE does not have an objection to this. Simply a reminder that the previous process included agency review of construction projects, which has not been in the bill recently.
So the agency is not concerned that this might result in school construction that isn't towards the long-term strategy of more and fewer.
Sure, so that's what that's referencing. We're just pointing out, of course, that disconnect between the required process, the agency's review, right? That was a two-step process. One being the secretary's review of the project and approval based on, a set list of criteria and statute, things such as statewide initiatives, regional capacities, it's sort of like, maybe I would term it as the advisability of the project, given the statewide initiatives. So that's part one of it. And then the second part would be more that financial test, which compared the amount of the bond.
So before we go to the financial test. So I guess when I read you have no objections, it sounds like you think that a full exemption from the excess spending threshold for all school construction without restrictions is a good idea. That's how I read no objections.
I don't know that I would read it that
Okay,
way. I think
okay.
they're expressing that there's considerations for sure that we're assuming folks are aware of
Okay,
with the language. So I think we're pointing those out to you
okay,
as consequences of the way it's written right now.
okay,
Maybe should be reviewed further.
okay.
So,
Thanks.
so back in the day, when eligible expenses were excluded from the excess spending threshold, is that kind of the old approach, what you're referring to there? Not even in new school construction, having to meet the secretary's approval and a whole list of things and towards a strategic. So if somebody built a new school, let's say a year or two ago, and that debt was not subject to the test, which what the Agency of Education used to do before, is what was eligible to exclude from excess spending threshold. Are you saying that that test should be applied?
Just pointing out that the way it's written right now, it would not be applied, right? Like as we're reading this, we're understanding that it would not be applied at this point. And so
It's a thought.
it is a thought.
Okay.
That's where I'm at. And so there's the secretary, for lack of a better term, maybe advisability of the project. They're just trying to really look at it from that statewide initiative and regional capacity type, whether it's the right move at the current conditions to take this project on. That was always a very serious consideration. And then secondly, there is that fiscal test where we refer to it at the agency as the MCSP. Maybe the terminology that you've heard is the COFF, C-O-F-F, not sure. But what that really did was it limited the amount of state participation. So it set a dollar value based on certain criteria, things such as student enrollment projections, educational specification documents to kind of overlay and come up with what would be the maximum amount of the cost of a project the state would participate in, sort of keeping it or even not just what the voters vote, but what was really necessary to fill the appropriate space. So just pointing out that as written, those we're reading that would no longer be required. It's unhooking that from the construction pre-approval, preliminary approval.
Okay,
Yep.
yeah, so section 2A, Senate version, excess spending, shifting from 118 to 112. So I ran some numbers using the FY27 budgets for testing these changes. The number of districts, and you've seen some of this analysis from Julia, the number of districts over the threshold would grow fourfold from 8 to 32. And coincidentally, 5 of those 32 districts voted down their FY27 budgets on town meeting day this year. 87 districts therefore would not be impacted by the statutory change. The ed spending per long-term weighted EM, ed spending per pupil amounts over the threshold would range from $5 to $2,900 in order to avoid the excess spending penalty. In the absence of any hold harmless provisions, these districts would have to reduce their ed spending per pupil by those same amounts, to equate to about 0% to 18% decreases. Most districts on that list are somewhere around 5% or less. For reference, only 19 districts had 0% or less growth in ed spending per pupil from 26 to 27. The ALE's position on the dropping from the 118 to 112, we don't object to that.
Do you support that?
I think what we can say is that we don't object to it. There, I think other options have been brought up, like phasing something in. But as it stands, we
Do you prefer we phase something in?
I don't think the AOE prefers that, no.
Okay. And then what you noticed about the inflator?
The next bullet,
Yeah,
yes. I think that's already been mentioned as well. It's the rate of inflation, which is historically less than the actual growth rates of ed spending. So over time, it would become more and more strict and limiting.
do you see that as a pro or a con? Would you recommend a different inflator? And not you personally, the agency.
Right, yes,
I'm asking.
that's gonna that would happen naturally, you know, and again. In the future, we don't know if this is gonna be in place for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depending on how long it takes for education reform to replace this. In the short term, in 1 year or 2 years, that might not be a significantly limiting factor. But if it was 3 or 4 years, depending on what inflation does, I mean, at this point, it kind of seems like inflation might be going higher, but it could go lower for some reason. In that case, then it becomes more and more strict. So it's naturally going to become more strict anyway, and then you're coupling that with a decrease from 118 to 112 in the threshold. So those two things could be a double whammy for districts in the longer term, 2 or 3 years.
And you're looking across budgets over the last many years. Does the agency have thoughts on what impact that might have on education quality or other agency goals?
We do recognize that it could lead to staffing cuts. The hope would be that there would be other policies or actions taken to limit any negative impacts on education quality. But it is possible to reduce spending and not reduce education quality.
Thank you. Where else? Oh,
Yeah, sorry, Representative Volker.
Curious, we had a conversation yesterday, and I think you heard from the superintendent Woodstock. I'm also concerned that the spending penalty is hitting some of our higher poverty rural high schools. And if they close their schools, they'll be weighted in the transition, but they might actually spend more. Have you looked at the impact of whether this is targeted at whether the chair of Senate Finance said this is a shot across the bow? Are we shooting across the right bows? Or are we arbitrarily hitting districts in ways that may actually create perverse incentives?
I think that in some ways, if the AOE noticed that this is kind of a blunt instrument, and given the way that it's written, it's going to affect all districts across the board in a similar fashion, where there could be alternatives where you customize some of the restrictions for certain districts depending on the circumstance. So that is a possibility.
All right, we're also recommending a strike to some of the language. So in the same section, number 12, we're asking or suggesting, I guess, to strike that last phrase there, plus any amount required to be added from capital construction reserve funds. We actually have not implemented that section. As an agency, we've not done that since probably the early 2000s. So it seems like an opportunity to ask for that to be removed. We also would add that in the current climate, over the years since the suspension, we would think it's best practice to actually engage in setting up reserve funds for some capital needs. And in that case, 5 years is a pretty small amount of time to expect those to actually be used. So it seems like maybe outdated language or maybe not quite the right fit now. So we would ask that that be considered to be stricken.
Representative Odie, do you have a question?
Yes, the AOE representative just said you might see it as a blunt instrument. But I am thinking he said, but there are ways that you could make that not a blunt instrument. And he did not say what those are. So I would like to hear that, please.
We did not prepare a list of alternative options at this time.
Yeah, the whole point is, I mean, I can imagine well, what can you imagine they might be?
I mean, honestly, I think that we can imagine a lot of different alternatives.
Can you name some?
Not at this time, no.
Because why?
I don't have I had some thoughts yesterday, last night and this morning, but I haven't prepared comments on that and I don't want to speak out of turn.
Thank you. We can certainly, if that's of interest, we could prepare maybe something more, but. we can have
I think that would be interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. On the other piece of the three hold harmless provisions, I'll read this as a form of relief for the districts currently significantly over or near the threshold. If they were to keep their ed spending or their ed spending per pupil amounts flat or less compared to the prior year, they would not be penalized for being over the threshold. As it's written. Alternatively, a panel of experts under the Secretary of Education would determine if the excess spending was for good cause. The AOE position on that is that these new provisions potentially dilute or litigate the intended goals of the excess spending mechanism and forgive to a degree those districts currently over the threshold. AOE does not support the third provision as drafted. And I think this has also been brought up this morning. Mathematically, if a district maintains flat ed spending over a longer period of time with declining enrollments, at some point their ed spending per pupil will increase to significant levels again. We were concerned about that.
Are you also opposed to the sort of good cause provision? I think there are two quite different provisions in my mind, and I'm
Yeah.
curious about your thoughts.
So we said we don't support the third provision as drafted, a good cause piece.
Okay, so neither.
I think it's just the lack of specificity to it, right? Like it would be a very difficult implementation of that and consistency and the specificity is just not there. I think that's more of the.
If you had recommendations on
Yeah.
what specificity on good cause would look like, and you could get them to us soon, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, we did talk about that. We
Okay.
talked about it in Yes, this morning, and I think the ideas was that we really would recommend working with BASBO to really understand a little bit more about it and to see what that list would look like.
Did you all testify on 220 before it left the Senate? Okay, thanks.
So one quick, to that point that you're saying, if education spending was maintained at a certain level, concern about per pupil spending going up, understood, because but would you be more in support of keeping that exit on that off ramp if it was per pupil spending was the same? You know what I mean? So you've got the three different exits right now. If per pupil spending is the same, if total district spending is the same, or you have a
Yeah, so it depends on which direction and how deeply the enrollment numbers change.
Yeah.
Any direction for those high spending districts in the downward direction is good. But some of the districts that are currently high spenders could bring down their spending significantly and still not get down to 0% increase over last year, in which case they would only receive, a smaller portion of the reward, if you will, for lowering their costs. I think that the AOE, we didn't specifically articulate it, but I think that we don't fully support the three provisions. The off-ramp position.
What about districts like Blue Mountain and Oxbow that are expected to increase spending under the proposed foundation plan that are going to be hit by the proposed excess spending penalty? How are they supposed to understand?
I don't think I know enough about the future provisions, but if we switch to the foundation formula, would the excess spending penalty even still be in play at that point?
No, but I think the point is we would be incentivizing very harmful and substantial cuts on them right now, even though our assumption is under the foundation plan, they would be better funded.
So you're saying without the three provisions, without the possibility of the third provision?
Well, I'm just wondering because in theory, we're supposed to be raising their spending, but they're gonna hit this.
We haven't looked at that specific instance.
And
And again, a with a single instrument, if you will, the blunt instrument, there's gonna be some winners and losers, and so that's the natural consequence. That you might need to write in some extra provisions in order to address those specific.
And so I think the Senate was trying to write in those provisions, and I think those provisions might not be as nuanced and might incentivize some weird behaviors that are not sort of towards our policy goals. And so any ideas you have on what those right provisions might be would be helpful, but
Yeah.
okay, thank you. Do you have anything else on the hold harmless provisions? And then your last comment about interstate districts?
So we're, as far as like any kind of legal opinion on whether or not the interstate districts are required to follow excess spending, I don't know that we are not able to give that. We would defer completely to Ledge Council on that legal interpretation, but we would be able to at least let you know what we've done in the past as the Agency of Education. So Team Finance at the Agency of Education has not ever held them to excess spending. The excess spending statute, we've not done that.
Doesn't your legal team provide statutory interpretation in order for you to carry out the laws?
They do.
So have they provided a statutory interpretation on this issue?
They have not.
Can they?
I can ask, but I do believe that.
It's not, legislative council can't interpret legislation for the administration. They can only interpret legislation for the legislature as we're changing laws and working on.
And I think that's what we're deferring to them on. If you wanted that legal interpretation, I wanna we're deferring to them for that.
I think we need a legal interpretation from you in the context of how you're carrying out the law as well. Okay, thank you. Any other things you'd like to say about all of the yield bill?
Covered the point.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts here?
No, considering your wealth of information, you've got a long memory. I wonder if it would be helpful for us to hear about why the yield is now in the December 1 letter, because it didn't used to be. Do you remember that process?
I do.
You were there when it happened.
I'm probably not the best person to speak to it. Representative Holcomb, I don't know if you know any history, I'm sorry, I'm probably just not the best person, I don't
It's a
wanna.
good story, so I thought it would be
Yeah,
helpful.
I'm sorry,
No,
I wish
that's okay.
that I knew.
Bill Talbot will give him.
Bill Talbot would be fantastic. You get him in, let me know, so I can listen. It was just in a little bit of a different role there, so I remember it more peripherally than directly, and so I would always just hate to comment on something I wasn't 100% comfortable with.
Thank you both very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jake and then Sue Chelsea?
Everybody? Okay. Jake Feldman, Tax Department. I have a couple slides that Saoirse posted under my name on your website, and also I remember. Oh, can you see it now?
But it was pretty good.
Thank you, Julia.
Anything spicy in there?
We're all gonna go back and watch the video and find out.
Okay, so actually quickly, the yields are in the December 1st letter, starting with Act 46, when they switched to the yields. There used to be a base rate, like around $1, and it would go up or down. This is not in my presentation, but I'm answering Holcomb's question.
Thank you. I was like, what's happening all of a
A
sudden?
different interpretation, if you'd like to hear it, which was, it's always bounced around. And at the time, the legislature was adding a lot of programs to the Ed Fund during the session, and we wanted people to see that it was bouncing around as the legislature made changes too. We talked about it as pulling back the curtain on the Wizard of Oz.
Okay. So I do have some feedback on the yield bill. The renter credit, I know that John went through it, and I can very briefly talk about that. And if you have any questions about the renter credit program, I could answer them. There were a few in the Senate. And then the excess spending threshold, we have a recommendation and some feedback on that. And then there's one more thing, which is a bit odd, but I want people to know what's going on with property tax credit income limits. Because we get a lot of questions, and when the questions start coming in, it's too late to change it. So I want to flag it for you now. So it has a little red flag next to it. Okay. So the first thing is in the bill that came over from the Senate, they made a 1-year change to the renter credit. And what they did, as John mentioned, is for credits that renters are going to get in the spring of 2027 when they file their taxes that are kind of based on their renting in calendar year 26. They're going to get like a 25% bump, basically. The tax department is going to calculate the credit instead of 10% of fair market rent paid over the year, it'll be 12.5%. And it's expected, I think JFO said at some point that it'll cost the general fund around 4 million. And that's why the original transfer was 104.9 and now it's 100.9. So that is what they did.
Thank you for putting this out, because we didn't really ask questions about this piece, but my understanding is that when you make this trans credit, that a significant portion of it just goes to the landlord in the form of higher rents. That's what research in other states would suggest. Did anyone look at whether doing a 1-year bump in credit might actually just lead to longer term higher rental prices? Or do you think people won't do it because it's only a year?
I'm not sure if landlords know about the credits that their renters are getting, and it definitely goes straight to the renter. So we actually, when we reformed the program, we actually kind of made it so that landlords and renters don't have to talk to each other. And landlords don't have to provide anything directly to renters. It all comes to the tax department, and then our work got a little harder. But then the money goes to the renter. I don't think this is going to be on landlords' radars. So a quick example, if you had a couple of people who are renting an apartment in Rutland County in 2026, the credit. So the way the credit is calculated, if it's 2 people, they get a credit based on the HUD's 2-bedroom apartment, what HUD thinks is the fair market rent. And normally tax department would take 10% of that fair market rent amount. But now we will be doing 12.5%. So it's a really easy, administratively easy thing for us to do. It's almost inconsequential. So for this example, they would get about $400 more if they're extremely low income. And then if they're higher than extremely low income, then the bonus wouldn't be as much because there's a phase out, a long phase out on the credit. So there's no cliffs in this one, which is great. But anyway, that's how it would work.
Just a quick, looking at your other slides, you have recommendations at the end of them. There's no recommendation on this.
No,
I'm just curious as to. Are you guys good?
Yeah, yeah, we're good. I just wanted to see. I just wanted to make sure, like, there was some misconceptions in the Senate about what's going on with renter rebate and renter credit. And if anybody has any questions, I could answer them quickly now.
What's the difference between a renter rebate and renter credit?
Sure, it used to be called the renter rebate. But it's not just the name.
All over the.
So good, thank you. That was,
Wasn't it? Okay, thank you. It used to be called renter rebate. The tax department reformed it or proposed a reform that the legislature approved of in maybe 2020-ish. It was based on studies on how to improve it. And I think the key thing to know is that it doesn't look at the rent you actually paid and compare it to your income. It just, it kind of standardizes it and it gets rid of some cliffs. So if you're 2 people, you get a credit based on a 2-bedroom apartment. If you're 3 people, it's a 3-bedroom apartment, and all the values are coming from HUD. The rent amounts, which are different by county, and the income limits also come from HUD. So, and it's all indexed for inflation. And if I could say one more thing, is that when we reform the program, when we propose this reform, that the legislature mostly went for, it stopped a big decline in how much renters were getting. It had been declining precipitously. We stopped it and it started going up because the whole thing's indexed appropriately. And then last year, the year before, we made the income limits higher, and that grew the program even more. We're spending now like 11 point something on it compared to 7 in 2020.
Representative Burkett, this may be a pretty basic question. So it is a refundable credit. So
Oh, yeah.
even folks who have like no tax liability would be getting the credit back. And then how, and this may not be a question for you, but how do you get at folks who have such low income that they're maybe not even filing income?
Right. Yeah, we encourage them to file. And we set up the form so that they can still, fill in what's necessary, and tell us about the income that they do have. So they're definitely eligible, and we reach out as much as we can, but that is a population that's hard to reach because it's linked to tax filing. Same with homestead.
Is there something new this year with the landlord contacting the tax department? And not actually working with the tenant?
No, that's not new. That change happened when we went to the renter credit. So instead of landlord handing a form to renters, or renters asking their landlords for this form, which can sometimes not be ideal, the landlord gives us a tax department form that says, here's my property and here are the people I rented to. And then we, on the back end, make the match. So that's what we changed.
So I have a case where the constituent has come to me, 2 people, 2 apartments in this building. Haven't got their rebate yet, but the others have. And the question was whether the landlord submitted the document. But he said, one document is for everybody, right?
Yeah, so it could be the case that the renters put in their claim, and when we went to check on the back end, we didn't see them. In which case, the tax department would reach out to both the renter and landlord to confirm. So there could be a delay on it. That being said, we're doing it much faster than we used to with the renter rebate.
Jake, that money, 7 million to 11 million, that comes from where?
The general fund.
Okay.
And so, and John mentioned this morning, the maximum credit is going up too, by a little bit. Okay, so that's just some context. We do have context and recommendation on the excess spending threshold. So as you guys were just talking about, the language that came over from the Senate has a new what's called an exclusion from the excess spending for new bonds that were approved after July 1st, 2024. So for high spending districts that are near or above excess spending threshold that have these new bonds, now those bond payments would be excluded. So it's good for them, but no one is thinking about, is the whatever is being bonded for, is it strategic? It'll hit the statewide ed fund like everything else. All of us will pay for it. And so the question is, does it make sense? And Rebecca and I talked about this a bit a few weeks ago. So that's something to consider there. The tax department does not like the kind of odd new constructs in the excess spending threshold, where if you can keep your per pupil spending or overall education spending the same as the prior year, you're exempt. It's a strange loophole, which is going to have some behavioral impacts. For example, the 6 or so districts who are over the threshold this year, if they can manage to keep per pupil spending or overall education spending level next year, keep those level, one of them level next year, then they're out. So it's quite unusual. It's also really different than kind of the entirety of how things work now. And also how things would work with a foundation formula where the money goes to the kids. So where the kids are, that's where the money goes. So it's getting away from per pupil spending. We're concerned about that one. And the last one that AOE just talked about too, we're concerned with this, where you can appeal to the secretary, not secretary, but secretary. That is gonna, it'd be very, very early in this morning. That's gonna limit the behavioral impact of the threshold itself. And it'll make yield setting really quite complicated because Julia will come in here in April or whatever and say, well, I don't really know quite what the yield should be because we have these appeals out to the secretary that are going to be heard in May, June, whatever. And it also makes it so districts couldn't really tell their voters what's up. They'd say like, well, your tax rate could be this, or it could be this if we get denied on our appeal. So the excess spending threshold, which is really the only bright line for cost control in the entire system, would get quite fuzzy with these new provisions. If you can imagine like a freshly painted line on a baseball field on a Saturday morning, and this is kind of like after all the little leaguers have run through it quite a bit. So no longer a bright line. So concerns about those things. I hope that those are struck. And a better idea would be to just set the excess spending threshold at an appropriate level, whatever you feel is reasonable. But not have these side pathways. Okay.
Yeah, how do we make sense of it when tax suggests something different from the AOE?
You make sense of it, however one makes sense of saying from the universe represented welcome.
This one, I'm sorry that it's coming so late, but out of curiosity, I plugged in the yield amounts in the Senate that the Senate passed to try to know what the income limit is going to be for property tax credits. And a little bit of context here. The tax department gets tons of questions about this. Possible my battery's gonna.
It's that charger is.
Work on mine.
It works on the staff.
I can try this one time. So the tax department gets, and that might work. The tax department gets a lot of questions about this because our household income form comes out and it says, for property tax credits are available to anyone whose income is up to whatever. And that number has been going down and down and down. And we say to them, to these people who call or email, we say, it's
They
not.
call and email us too.
Yes. We say it's not us, it's just it's a mathematical thing, and people are very unsatisfied by that.
It is very unsatisfactory, yes.
Okay, yeah, and it has really been going down. It used to be that around 2/3 of homesteads got an income-based credit a few years ago, and now in the most recent year of data that I have that's complete, it's half. If the yields as passed go through, it would be less than half because the income limit would be all the way down to 109. In the yields that you guys passed, or the House passed, it would be 1085. So anyway, it's going way down. And we would recommend, and I'm sorry that this is coming so late that we make a change now. To do something about it. It will be too late next year to do anything about it because tax will have already put out its forms that say the income limit is 109.
So we've at various times over the years taken testimony on what happens when we do such things. Julie likes to call it squeezing the balloon. Julia's not here. Can you describe the balloon squeeze and what would happen?
Yeah, no, it's definitely in the balloon squeeze realm. So what would happen is that people who are over 90,000 of income, but who have houses that are worth more than $225,000, which is pretty much everybody in that zone, could potentially get a slightly bigger credit. So their benefit would be expanding. And the way the Ed Fund works, that means that the rates for homesteads and non-homesteads would have to be slightly higher. I'm estimated the impact of this as $6 million in FY 28. So everybody would have to pay a little bit more to do this. So the question is why? Well, the reason is for it's just not intuitive to have the income limit keep dropping on something like this over and over again. We also are hoping to eventually get to the homestead exemption. And if you remember from Julia's blue and white tables about winners and losers, there's a funny patch around 90,000. And that's hard to deal with because there's a massive cliff in our current system. That's where it goes from covering you at 400,000 in house site value to down to 225. So that's a really big cliff. If you changed it to 250, it would shrink the cliff a little bit, which is helpful as we kind of go to a staircase system, not a cliff system. So that's a reason to do it. And then, yeah, answering questions from constituents and taxpayers about it is the other reason. And I tried to, Julia slammed my graph this morning already, but I tried to represent it graphically to show what would be happening, but you would be shrinking the cliff, and then the green is kind of like the outward credit amounts. And then the new household income limit, instead of going down to 109, it would go up to 121. So yeah, very late in the game, but it would be a good step if it happened.
I think this points out that I'm sure all of us have constituents contacting us about it. It doesn't make sense for the income limit to keep decreasing, especially when real estate values are increasing. But the fact that it's self-funding by increasing overall property taxes to fund the credit is a little off-putting, because you don't want to do that unless we use some other source of funds in order to pay for that increase in the credit.
Right. Yeah, I will say though, that, like, if you think about it, property tax rates might change a little bit, but the net amount of property tax that the state has to collect is not going to change because of this.
Right.
What's really going to happen, Representative Kimball, is that right now, if you look at the Ed Fund Outlook, property tax credits cost about 134, I think. Next year, when Julia and I do the December 1st letter, that's going to come way down to like 120-ish. I don't know. But if you do this, it'll still be coming down, but not as much. So the question is, where do you want to get the property tax money from? Do you want to get it from shrinking credits or from the rates? That's the choice.
The difficulty is because the property tax bills keep going up, so you think the credit should actually be increasing, and it's not, it's going down.
Yeah, in some cases, it's hyper complicated.
Yeah, so it just doesn't make sense if you're suffering from a now higher tax bill and your credit goes down.
Right. Yeah.
Or you're suddenly, I think it's more like you're suddenly not eligible for it.
Well,
Yeah.
which would be
Yes.
a huge down.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 It's very late in the process for us to put this in anything. I don't actually even know if it's mechanically possible. And I think in past years, we haven't done this because of how it would, that sort of pressure point of people whose taxes would go up because of it. Ideally, we're on sort of this temporary ramp of a few years. Can you just talk more about all of your thinking on that?
All of our thinking on that?
That sort of, that mix.
Yeah.
Because I agree that it's an important thing to address if we can. I'm just,
Yeah, well, first of all, I apologize for not bringing it to the committee's attention sooner. I was out of personal curiosity that I was wondering what the income limit will be. And
like big red flag when you realize what it was.
it's kind of a big red flag. I know we're gonna get a lot of questions on it. But the thing about Julia's point about squeezing the balloon is totally true. This is just like a policy kind of trade-off, like, you know, we are hoping to eventually get to the homestead exemption, which is a much more kind of like maneuverable policy. So this is a step towards that because it's shrinking the cliff. The cliff is like one big problem you have to deal with. So it's a trade-off. It's not perfect by any means.
And why? Why did you pick the point where you picked?
The 250? That's a good question. I mean, it could have been higher, but maybe, you know, some of this is dependent on where property values and incomes go. But, you know, it could be 250 this year, and then next year we could come back with the same kind of presentation and say, let's do set 275. So it's just a modest increase. $6 million is 1/3 of a percentage point on the average bill change, roughly. So to give you some sense of scale.
Any other questions for Jake? Yeah, Jim.
Just, I got an email a couple of weeks ago from, former Representative Friedman, I think, so.
I think he wrote to many.
Say again?
I think they wrote to many people. Yes.
Okay, well, anyway, he was urging us to do something very similar to what you're recommending, and if it's, as you and the chair discussed, may not be practical to do that this year, but if there's a way to do it, I would certainly support it.
Representative Bryan?
Have you run it by Senator Cummings?
We emailed the idea, but I don't know if we even testified on the yield bill in the Senate.
Starts with us. I'm just wondering if she has said no way or, and what about the governor's?
The governor's office is in support. Yeah, they, you know, recognize the problem of the income limit keep going down and also saying, you know, hoping to shrink the cliff as we go to the homestead exemption.
And I don't understand what you were saying, Jake, about, I mean, it's intuitive, I suppose, that the tax rate would have to go up to cover that. But then you said you thought the outlook page would show something like 120,000. Why? So that's lower.
Right, so, if the house site value was bumped up to 250, then the line on the ed fund outlook would be $6 million higher than it otherwise would have been. And then I was trying to say that it's probably going to go down next year. Like we're spending 134 in FY27. It's probably going to go down to maybe 120-ish in FY28. But instead of it going down to 120, this could make it go down to like 126. And it's impossible to know for sure, but that is generally. So
Right now it's at
131. 34, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it wouldn't be impossible. You have to do some quick.
Yes.
Shuffling, but.
Yeah.
Yeah. Appreciate you bringing that in.
Representative Odie?
I guess I would need to know what makes it, other than the timing, why couldn't we do this? Jake?
I don't track closely like, where bills are and the mechanics of everything. The administrative timing for the tax department works. The issue is where bills are in the process right now, and if this committee wants to change the yield bill and send it back, which I defer to the chair, obviously.
Thanks.
Yeah, Representative Gomez. Jake had sent me a very interesting file a while ago on homesteads and grand lists, which is sort of interesting. Maybe we could ask, but I know I'm so excited about the tax study, but there's some pretty.
Everyone's really excited about
Okay,
the tax study.
I'm really excited about that too. But there's some interesting patterns. I mean, I think you're right, and especially when the grand lists are growing so much faster than spending, for example, in some places, it's creating. There's just some interesting. Looks like there's some interesting correlations between growth in homesteads and growth in grand list.
Growth in homestead values?
Yes.
Okay.
No, growth in number of homesteads.
Okay.
Yes. That grand list values may be growing faster in places that may not be increasing homesteads.
Yes.
It will be worth understanding, and it also speaks, and I'm not to pick on Woodstock, we always used to.
Let's not pick on Woodstock.
No, but I think their problems are real. I'm actually empathetic. I'm not picking on them.
Thank you, Jake. Really
Thanks.
appreciate it. We will figure out if and how we could do something about this. I really appreciate you bringing it. Let's do.
Human services.
Okay, cool.
I think that I'm running late. Do you give me full permission to?
Do you want me to grab her or you just want to do it without?
I think she's
Okay, cool.
actually testified.
Floor is yours.
So as much as I would love for her to be here with me, I am happy to do it. I might also defer because some of the stuff is more her wheelhouse for when she's available.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
You don't have a presentation, so it's your written.
No, just
Okay.
It's on the website.
Thanks.
Hi, Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. It's nice to see you all. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on H 949. We recognize that Vermonters are under real strain. Rising property taxes, housing costs, and healthcare expenses are putting pressure on families across the state. School leaders feel that same pressure and work every year to balance community impact with maintaining educational quality. I'll first start with talking about the use of one-time funds to buy down the tax rate. It will come as no shock to you where we come in on this. We remain deeply concerned about the continued reliance on property tax buydowns. While this approach may provide short-term relief, it does not support sustainable school district budgeting. Districts do not build budgets and voters do not vote on budgets based on the buydown yield. Instead, it creates an ongoing structural mismatch that makes each subsequent budget cycle more difficult. This approach masks the true cost of the education system, perpetuates a cycle of instability for districts and voters, and contributes to the misperception about cost increases. At a broader level, this policy approach continues to avoid some of the cost pressures, including demographic shifts in an aging population, housing shortages, limiting enrollment stability, and rising healthcare costs. These pressures have built over time. Continuing to rely on short-term buydowns does not address them and shifts the burden onto local communities. Our asks for this section is to not use all of the one-time funds for property tax buydowns and redirect even a portion of these funds toward long-term cost drivers, including school construction aid to support regionalization and efficient use of facilities, and incentives for locally driven research-based consolidation. I can pause because that's the end of that section, or I can just keep going, whatever people would prefer.
I think you can keep going because no one has answered on that section.
Okay. And so next is about the excess spending penalty and the reduction to 112%. We appreciate elements of the current framework in H 949, including the use of excess spending threshold instead of hard caps. However, we are very concerned with the proposal to reduce the threshold from 118 to 112 in a single year. Reducing the threshold on such an accelerated timeline will have harmful consequences. Districts are currently operating from an FY25 baseline around the excess spending threshold. It's sometimes a misconception that that's where we are
setting the excess spending penalty from in the field even. So I just wanted to call that out. And the projected threshold is approaching the proposed foundation formula level next year at 112%. Lowering the threshold this quickly risks forcing rapid reductions in spending that are disconnected from a thoughtful system redesign. This will result in accelerated cuts to student programming and staff, disproportionate impacts on districts with structural cost constraints such as tuitioning, and reduced educational opportunity on a faster timeline than the broader education reform transition itself. Cost drivers and structural pressures. This policy also does not address the primary drivers of rising costs. Healthcare up 35% in 3 years, and it's approaching approximately 15% of the total of school budgets. Inflationary pressures, the fixed obligations from collective bargaining agreements, mental health responsibilities, and construction costs, which have been largely unsupported at the state level for nearly 2 decades. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that not all cost pressures sit outside of the system. Vermont's education system includes structural factors that contribute to overall spending, including the number of districts, schools, and staffing levels relative to enrollment. Vermont has one of the lowest student to staff ratios in the nation, and despite significant staffing reductions over the past several years, that ratio has remained stagnant and in some cases declined further. This reflects a fundamental reality. Cuts cannot outpace enrollment decline. Districts are reducing staff, but enrollment is falling at a rate that continues to drive per pupil costs upward. Continuing to push reductions under these conditions will not solve the problem. It will simply erode student opportunity. At a certain point, additional cuts mean fewer course offerings, reduced student supports, loss of programs, and opportunities for students. These are not theoretical risks. They are already happening. This is not a question of whether districts are willing to make difficult decisions. Those decisions have been ongoing for several years. It is a question of whether policy recognizes the limits of those reductions and the consequences for students. The following examples, and I hope you'll appease me in reading some of these real scenarios shared by superintendents. They're anonymized, but
yeah, read a little slower.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I reached out to superintendents that are going to be most impacted by the excess spending penalty. It is something I am told often, so I apologize.
Relatable.
And I asked them to send me anecdotes and specifics about how the 112% excess spending threshold would impact their communities. One district with full high school choice would need to reduce approximately 1.5 million to meet the threshold. While there has been discussion of requiring students to attend a single in-system high school to reduce costs, this would represent a significant shift away from longstanding community expectations around choice. Another K-6 district, where approximately 55% of its budget is tied to tuition and special education costs for students tuitioning primarily to an independent school, would need to cut approximately 1.5 million. The district has no control over the high school tuition rates. This year it was $25,000 per student, yet those costs are fully included in the calculation. A small rural district serving 2 elementary schools on already operating multi-grade classrooms would need to reduce $570,000 or just under 9% of its budget. The district is already sharing specialists such as library and counseling staff. The 2 towns are connected primarily by mountain roads, including dirt roads, making consolidation impractical. With nearby school closures in recent years, further consolidation would require pre-K students to travel 30 minutes or more, often in difficult winter conditions. In the same supervisory union, 3 non-operating districts would experience little to no impact under the penalty, as they have minimal discretionary spending. At the same time, they continue to receive small school or sparsity weighting, creating what was described as an unfair advantage over operating districts that must make programmatic cuts. One district reported a 4% decline in weighted student count spread across grade levels. Because the decline is not concentrated, the district cannot reduce spending in a targeted way. It has reduced staff for FY27 to meet class size minimums. Come on up, Sue. Okay. Due to some of the districts being non-operational for some grades, it would disproportionately impact K-8 students. Under the proposed threshold, the supervisory union would need to cut approximately 4 million total, 32 FTEs, all transportation, athletics, field trips, extracurriculars, enrichment, and related arts programs. Another district reported that at the 112% level, the district would need to cut approximately 40 positions, athletics and performing arts, world language programs, interventionists, instructional coaches. Reductions would extend to related arts counselors, mental health clinicians, and nurses. Another district outlined likely reductions across grade bands, talking about K through 8, elimination of band, chorus, visual arts, drama, technology, education, world language, and library services. And 9 through 12, reduced electives and advanced placement offerings with more study hall time and less classroom instruction. I don't think that's what any of us would like. In a district with a supervisory union that allows school choice after elementary school, 3 towns would need to cut approximately $500,000 from their elementary school budgets alone to meet the threshold. And I want to emphasize that this is a common theme through the anecdotes, is that when you're limited to like K through 8 operating, tuition is fixed and it only comes from the elementary grades, those cuts. In a small district that has already closed 2 schools and now operates only 1 remaining school, approximately $320,000 in cuts would still be required. The district tuitions students for grades 7-12 to multiple receiving schools, including out of state, limiting its ability to control costs. A neighboring district in the SU tuitions all high school students, consists of 1 school, and would need to cut approximately $285,000 despite having limited control over tuition costs. The supervisory union expanded pre-K to meet community needs and state goals. However, because of how spending is calculated, this expansion, while good for the community, has artificially inflated per pupil spending, perversely pushing us closer to the penalty threshold. In addition, the district is seeing discrepancies in the state data for long-term weighted ADM. I wanted to pause on that one too. One modified unified district after already reducing its budget this year with stable enrollment would need to make an additional about $500,000 reduction. This represents roughly a 3% cut with reserves nearly exhausted. That was another theme, a lot of reserves being used to help offset the inflationary pressures. As described, there's no meat left to cut. So bringing all of those anecdotes together, we see structural inequities within the penalty. One is tuition dependent districts. Some districts have limited flexibility with a significant portion of spending tied to tuition. These districts have very few levers to adjust budgets and will be forced to reduce core program to their elementary grades only. I also want to point out a little bit about the inequity that you all addressed in your version of H955 that talks about the differences spent between tuition and what parents pay to independent schools, section 24 of your bill, that has been stripped from the Senate education version of the bill. So exacerbating some inequities there as well.
I have a question about that. So I think what you're saying is that the uncontrollable costs at the secondary level are forcing districts at tuition at the secondary level to make cuts.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe that's something we need to think about with the weighting study, because tuition students were excluded from the weighting study. And so if the disproportionate cost in these districts is at the secondary level, maybe understating the actual cost of education in the state. So it's for a lot of those districts.
The second piece that we want to talk about with the inequities with the excess spending is pre-K expansion. The state continues to emphasize pre-K as a critical investment for quality and equity, yet districts expanding pre-K may be penalized for doing so. One district reported that expanding a clearly needed pre-K program is the reason that the excess spending penalty would be triggered. This is a direct misalignment of policy and priorities. Capital bonding inequity, H949 excludes voter approved bonds prior to July 1, 2024. I'm sorry, I misstated that. Current law excludes bonds from July 1, 2024 from excess spending. I will correct that for the record. Creating inequity between districts based on timing rather than on need, including some bond payments, but not others, will require some districts to make dramatic cuts that harm students while others will be held harmless. Our ask to you all is we urge the legislature to implement a gradual phase down aligned with the foundation formula timeline, coupled with a graduated spending floor. I swear I did not consult with Sherry Souza on that. Honestly, she put it in there before I did. Address structural issues alongside any penalty, including restrictions or guardrails on tuition. Excluding pre-K spending from the excess spending calculation and committing to fully funding it at one FTE. Correcting known issues with weighting based on existing research. And I linked the memo from Tammy Colby on that. We feel like if it's a research-based funding formula, we should be looking closely at things that the architect of that system has said are incorrect weighting in our current funding formula. And then ensuring equitable treatment of capital construction across districts. And then I will let Sue talk about the last one.
The last one is pair any spending control mechanism with action on cost drivers rather than applying it in isolation. And an example of that would be holding districts harmless for increases in health insurance premiums above an appropriate inflationary index. And in closing, an Agency of Education FY27 school district budget update yesterday shows that anticipated increase in education spending is now 3.9%, demonstrating that school districts are doing the difficult work of balancing taxpayer impact while maintaining education quality. What is needed now is not additional short-term pressure, but a coordinated approach that addresses the real cost drivers, recognizes structural realities, aligns policy with stated priorities, supports a stable transition to a new funding system. We urge you to focus on solutions that are sustainable, equitable, and centered on student opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. The Senate's mechanisms for exceptions to the excess spending threshold.
At first glance, hold harmless language is appealing to us. I did note some of the concerns today. So if it's okay, I'll go back to my members tomorrow and give more specifics on that.
Yeah, it gives me some flashbacks to
27.
Yes.
Yes, I'm happy to get more specifics on that. I just am not prepared for today.
Thank you. And school construction doesn't seem as sort of complex, but does seem like it could drive behaviors that are not in line with
I mean,
policy goals.
Yes, there is an approval process for the Agency of Education, so that seems like a bit of a stopgap. I know they were saying it doesn't necessarily, or what I understand them to be saying is that there wasn't necessarily a correlation with this and the excess spending. But in order to receive state aid for construction, should it ever come, they do need to get approval. And so there is that process to try to make sure that it's within the scope of what we're looking for in long-term policy goals. It just seems like an arbitrary stop to when those voter bonds are approved or excluded and not excluded just doesn't really seem fair. So.
Thank you. So one of the problems I have with this proposal as it's in front of us, like the language that's in front of us, is that it's penalizing certain districts without doing anything to support those lower spending districts, right? And we've talked about, I didn't want to really share it. It's your job. So floating the idea of a floor, I think that there are some districts who, are underspending by choice when they could afford to spend a little more. I don't think that's true in my district. So my concern with the floor has always been, how do we pay for it? So I'm just curious what your thoughts on that observation might be.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to how we pay for it, but inevitably in passing Act 73 and subsequently voting at H955 out, you're leading up to doing the same exact thing, right? And so I would suggest that that's a broader global question, not just specific to this particular bill. And one of the things is like the graduated approach will be much more palatable, I think, for communities than a sudden hit to either huge tax swings or extreme education spending declines. So the more we can do to kind of smooth that is the priority for us and for, I think, Vermonters at large. So.
Chelsea, you mentioned one of the superintendents said that they were incurring the excess spending threshold or over it because of their expansion of pre-K, which was encouraged by the state Do you know if in that example, the school is offering more than the 10 hours of
They are.
pre-K? So they're expanding it beyond the 10, maybe to 20 or?
Some full days, this particular district, I believe, is doing full day. It is not the only district I heard that from. And it's especially acute in rural communities where there just are not other options for birth to 3 or 4. So this particular one, I believe, is full day, but I am not positive, so I'll have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, so I mean, we always talk about where the money's coming from, whether it's CCFAP or what's coming from the ed fund to pay for those services. So that still highlights the issue we have there.
Yeah.
Do you know if those districts, I know that some districts have organized themselves to be able to accept CCFAP. Do you know if those districts?
Yeah, I talked to at least one of them, and yes, they are using CCFAP, but they also reminded me that should it be weighted full-time FTE, they would not need that.
Thanks for passing that on.
Well, so they would prefer the full-time FTE to the way that they're currently funding their pre-K, is what they told me.
In like very casual conversations, at the last superintendent's lunch, it sounded like districts that were billing CCFAP were able to like really fully fund their pre-K programs with it.
I've not heard that.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing is if they use classroom space, then that limits their ability to bring in elementary students from other schools, buildings that might otherwise be closed. I mean, if they're dedicating pre-K space classroom for pre-K. I've heard that pressure is that pre-K is taking over, you know, all these different classes. It used to be first grade and that kind of stuff.
Anyone else? Thank you both so much. Thanks for the multiple committees testimony in a single morning session.
I just want to make sure I clear up that they did not say that they were not appreciative of the CCFAP and not, yes, okay. Yeah. But that a full-time FTE would cover the cost of what they need to expand. Okay.
Thank you.
If that's clarity.
I did
not get myself in trouble.
understand that from what you just said. So, no. Okay, thank you both. Would really appreciate particularly feedback on adding more nuance to those exemptions carved out, however you want to describe them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Beth, do you want to go since you're sitting there?
Yeah.
Cool.
Now my brain is this one.
Right.
Just want to turn it back on. Think about what Kelsey and Sue just said. So, good morning, Jeff Fannin, Executive Director of Vermont EA for the record. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you a bit about H949 as I think it's passed the Senate, or maybe it's on the floor now. I don't know. There was one in. It did. Okay. You know better than I do. Congratulations.
Sorry, I should have announced it.
No, it's all good. Sue touched on this. Yesterday, you heard from the Agency of Education. Education spending is at, I thought it was 3.9, although I heard somebody say 2.9. Either way, it's a moderate, appropriate level of spending increase given inflation. And so I think school boards are doing the right thing and managing to what their community schools need. And they're not excess spending, they're not frivolously spending. And I think that's the right thing to do. The current spending restriction, the excess spending penalty, is set at 118, the statewide average per pupil spending amount. The Senate's proposal dropped it to 112. The proposed spending penalty is immediate and significant. I think Chelsea testified about the immediacy of it, and that's too abrupt for schools to digest, if you will. There are significant changes going on in many places in the education world right now, at the federal level, at the state level. and to change the funding model, if you will, so immediately and so significantly on top of all those other federal changes and state changes and all the changes throughout is just not going to be well received, I think, by the school communities at large. So I think that it's too much too quickly. We don't support going to 112, put it bluntly. You heard also, and I'll echo this, the difference between operating and non-operating and the incentives we currently have in the system that may be favoring non-operating districts. And certainly, as Chelsea pointed out, K-8 or K-6 programs that then tuition thereafter, the only place they have to absorb the excess spending penalty additional tax, and that's what it is, a double tax, is on their elementary school. And so that's inherently unfair to the elementary school system. And there's no such corresponding restrictions on the amount that they're sending schools, sending dollars to receiving schools in that private setting. So that's inherently unfair. The system needs to be resolved and fixed in that regard. And this will make it even worse. I'll say that. The buy down. We don't think using it all at once is the right approach, like your approach, more moderate, measured approach. It does, as Chelsea pointed out, create an enormous hole next year that schools will have to resolve, you will have to resolve, we'll all have to resolve and deal with. We don't think that's recommended. So we don't think the all at once right now is the best approach. I think a slower or don't use it all at once right now is our recommendation. It creates a whipsaw effect for schools that they really don't deserve. As well, and interesting, I want to follow up with Jake. I'm sorry I missed him, but we think the buy down, if any, should be used. There should be some bought down. I'm not saying that, but it's more targeted to working Vermonters.
How would we do that?
Well, I think there are more creative minds than mine, but certainly if you're going to buy it down, you heard from Jake about the property tax, income tax, and how we're driving it down. I mean, that just seems not good policy right now that we've gone from that. I can't remember the chart in front of
It's
me.
not really policy, it's like a mathematical.
That's policy. Math can be changed. That's a decision that we should change right here and right now to lower those taxes for those folks. So again, the buy down, maybe that's part of it. That's where you use some of it, but it should be targeted to those folks at the working class Vermonters who are struggling right now. Inflation's hurting them.
Yeah.
So I think that's bulk of what I have to say. We don't like the 112 immediately. We don't like the buy down, all of it and using it, and we think it should be targeted more.
You don't have ideas to target it.
Well, I like, as I said, I'd like to explore with Jake what they were saying. I think he said that was $6 million. Maybe that's part of the buy down goes towards that.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Jeff, you didn't mention anything about the not including bonding money in the excess spending. You supportive of that?
Certainly schools have been deprived, if you will, of state aid for school construction for almost 2 decades now, 2007. And it's about time that changed because many schools, Ursa Kimball, have struggled with that issue. Other schools have been able to pass bonds. And it's been in a haphazard, I would say coordinated fashion. So for example, there are places where, given where we want to go and a more efficient school delivery system in the future, they may have brand new schools that may not fit geographically, if you will, or newer schools. Or meanwhile, other places are struggling to pass a budget right now and can't afford to even think about a bond, and their schools are crumbling. And so, but maybe they're the school that we should be building up and rehabbing a lot. So I think we need to be focused on our attention about school construction. We think that's the, as you redistrict and have that conversation, we do believe firmly that school construction aid is the incentive to make that happen because the need is significant. I served a couple of years ago on the school construction task force, whatever it was named back then. The need is between $6 and $9 billion. That was a couple of years ago. And I don't know if you've built anything lately or had somebody do something in your house. Those costs have gone up dramatically and continue to go up. So that's $6 to $9 billion from, I think it was 3 years ago. We put the inflator on construction materials and salaries for people to drive nails and pour concrete and that sort of thing. I'd say it's well in excess of $10 billion at this point. And we've not done anything. So I think we got to get serious about that. I appreciate opening up the bank account last year. I joke about this. We opened up a bank account last year at school construction. We didn't put any money into it. It's sort of what my bank account looked like when I was in college. There was no money in it, but it looked great. I had a bank at the Merchant Bank at UVM. So those remember that. So school construction, we do believe, is the incentive for transforming school education. And the motto then, and I think now, is still newer and fewer.
The other exemptions that are built into the Senate's version of the yield bill, do you have any idea on how to bring a little bit more? I understand the agency being uncomfortable with sort of being the ones who litigate that. Do you have ways that process might work better?
The exemptions to the
Excess spending threshold, the idea that you could get basically approval to be exempt from the excess spending threshold.
I mean, it's rather insulting. I'm not speaking on behalf of the School Board Association, but the whole excess spending thing, I think, is rather insulting. It's not as if I think there's any single school district, school board, or school district around the state spending unnecessarily. I mean, I go into schools, meet with members. I've been in schools where they're taking videos and slideshows of all the school construction needs. Kids have significantly higher needs. During the pandemic, we heard directly from the administration that the mental health system in the state, in certain parts of the state, and they thought it would roll through the rest of the state, had collapsed. That was their word. We've done nothing about that. And so that has shifted enormous cost to the education system. So I think anything we do to relieve a penalty, a tax increase on people who are not spending frivolously, I don't think, is good. So I would suggest that you could expand those. And I would suggest that's the better approach, because I don't think anybody's spending unnecessarily. I will look and see if there's some better ways, more targeted ways. But certainly school construction, it seems arbitrary to me as to when the bonding happened.
School construction, I mean, the other exemptions for the excess spending threshold that the AOE gets to approve, or just sort of
Well, it's the AOE and a
something
group
like
of
that.
business managers and superintendents, I think it is. Seems odd to me, truthfully, that they would go back and examine. I do think there has to be some release valve to allow schools to say, hey, our boiler blew up, our roof is leaking.
Okay,
That's happening now. I mean, in one of the school districts, I heard from teachers on my board who said the kids know where to put the buckets because the roof is leaking. And this isn't a Chittenden County school.
And so separate from.
I understand.
I'm just wondering if you do have suggestions on how to make that, you said it was weird, make it a little better, maybe add more rules to it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're talking, what you're talking about specifically is the secretary and the business managers and superintendents. That process seems odd to me, but I will explore that, think about it.
I'm just wondering if that's even appropriate. Like, if this is gonna.
I don't know if it is, yeah.
This is gonna become so tight, and I keep coming back to a lot of this is accounting and timing, and they need a 2-year runway. It takes them 3 years to change anything because they're so hyper-regulated. And so we're asking them to make decisions that may be driven by timing on deals they just inked. And so is that okay? Like, is it?
I don't know. That's what I'm asking. Yeah, exactly.
I'll echo that, and I'll just give an example.
I'm just telling you.
We received a sizable grant, or we just got it, and we're going to pilot 3 schools with and their administration and their local leaders, my members and local educators. It's with the American Psychological Association and the University of Maryland School of Medicine's National Center on School Mental Health. It's basically talks about, we need healthy people inside the building to work with kids. You gotta have both healthy kids and healthy people, adults in their lives. Trying to schedule a meeting for that has been enormously difficult, and not because anybody doesn't want to do it, but getting people to lift their head up and look down the road seems near impossible, truthfully. And they want to do this work. They need this work to be done, and getting them to look further ahead is impossible. So to Representative Holcomb's point, we need to give schools time to implement these changes, and going from 118 to 112, for example, immediate change is not fair.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time today. We are going to be done for the morning. We are back here after the floor. Ben, thank you. Elizabeth, please.